Tonight, we travel to a forgotten corner of American history, where the map showed a town, the railroad remembered a station, and a handful of weathered letters hinted that an entire community once lived there. What follows is the story of a place that disappeared so completely that later generations argued whether it had ever existed at all. In the autumn of 1891, a freight conductor riding west through the high plains of Colorado reported seeing a town lit by lanterns at midnight. He noted a church bell, smoke rising from chimneys, and nearly 50 houses gathered around a water tower. When his train returned along the same track 3 nights later, the town was gone. The station sign remained beside the rails, but beyond it stretched only empty grassland under the moon. The last lantern of Black Hollow. The story begins with Elias Mercer, a railroad surveyor who arrived in Colorado during the spring thaw of 1872. He was a practical man who trusted measurements, not legends. His notebooks contained precise distances, elevations, and sketches of river bends. Yet among those pages was one entry that seemed unlike the others: valley beyond the eastern ridge. Water abundant. Soil black as coal. Suitable for settlement. Elias named the place Black Hollow after the dark earth that stained his boots. Within 2 years, farmers, carpenters, and miners had built a small town there. The railroad added a modest station, and stagecoaches began stopping twice a week. Black Hollow never grew large, but it prospered quietly. Children attended a one-room schoolhouse. A doctor kept an office beside the general store. On Sundays, the church bell echoed across the valley. Among the first settlers was Margaret Hale, a widow from Missouri who became the town's teacher. She rented a room above the bakery and spent her evenings writing letters to her sister. Those letters, discovered decades later in a trunk in Kansas City, would become the strongest evidence that Black Hollow had truly existed. Margaret described a town that seemed almost too peaceful for the frontier. She wrote about children skating on a frozen pond, about wildflowers covering the hills in June, and about lanterns glowing warmly along Main Street during winter storms. She also wrote about a strange habit shared by nearly every resident: no one stayed outside after the church bell rang 9 times at night. At first she assumed it was a local custom. Then she noticed something unsettling. Whenever the bell rang, conversations stopped. Storekeepers closed their doors immediately. Even the dogs became quiet. One evening she asked the blacksmith why the town emptied so suddenly. The man stared at her for a long moment before answering, because the valley belongs to daylight. Margaret laughed, expecting a joke, but the blacksmith did not smile. For several years, life continued normally. Black Hollow's harvests were excellent, and travelers spoke well of the town. Then, during the winter of 1883, a violent blizzard trapped a stagecoach on the eastern road. 3 passengers staggered into town after midnight seeking shelter. According to the church records, none of them remained until morning. The official explanation was that they continued west before dawn. Yet Margaret later wrote that she saw the stagecoach still standing outside the hotel at sunrise, buried in snow, with no horses and no passengers. The hotel owner refused to discuss it. After that winter, Black Hollow changed. New settlers rarely stayed long. A merchant from Denver abandoned his store after only 6 weeks. A family from Nebraska left without collecting their belongings. Travelers began avoiding the valley altogether. Elias Mercer noticed the decline when he returned in 1885. The town looked intact, but the streets were unusually quiet. He asked Margaret whether the mines had failed. No, she replied. People simply stopped wanting to remain here. That evening, Elias walked through Black Hollow and found nothing visibly wrong. The buildings were well maintained. Gardens flourished behind the houses. Children played near the schoolhouse. Yet he sensed a tension beneath the ordinary routines, as though the entire town were listening for something distant. At 9 o'clock, the church bell rang. Every window closed. Elias, irritated by what he considered superstition, stayed outside. He sat on a bench beside the general store and waited. The valley became unnaturally still. The wind died. The creek that ran through town seemed to hush itself. Then, from beyond the eastern ridge, he heard footsteps. Not one set of footsteps. Hundreds. They moved across the hills in perfect rhythm, approaching the town without voices, without horses, without the creak of wagons. Elias stood and peered into the darkness. He could see nothing, but the sound continued drawing closer. A hand seized his arm. Margaret pulled him inside the general store and bolted the door. Through a crack in the shutters, Elias watched the empty street. The footsteps entered town. Dust rose from the road as if invisible travelers were passing by. A loose newspaper skittered across the street. The sign above the barber shop swung back and forth. For nearly 10 minutes, the unseen procession moved through Black Hollow. Then the footsteps faded toward the western hills. Elias demanded an explanation. Margaret answered quietly. It happens every night. What happens? No one knows. Elias refused to accept that answer. The next morning he questioned every resident he could find. Some claimed the sounds had existed since before the town was founded. Others said they began after miners opened a shaft in the eastern ridge. A few insisted the valley had always belonged to people who no longer appeared in daylight. Unable to tolerate uncertainty, Elias organized an expedition. 4 men agreed to accompany him to the ridge after sunset. They carried rifles, lanterns, and enough supplies for a night in the hills. Margaret begged him not to go. Then come with us, he said. She shook her head. I've heard the footsteps. I have no desire to meet whoever makes them. The expedition left town at dusk. Residents watched from their porches but offered no farewell. At 9 o'clock, the church bell rang across the valley. The 5 men continued climbing. Hours later, only Elias returned. He stumbled into Black Hollow just before dawn, exhausted and covered in mud. When Margaret found him outside the church, he was staring at the eastern ridge with a look she had never seen before. Where are the others? She asked. Elias did not answer immediately. Finally he whispered, I don't know. According to the account he gave later, the men had reached a narrow pass overlooking a hidden basin. There they saw hundreds of lanterns moving below them, arranged in long lines like a nighttime procession. Believing they had discovered another settlement, Elias called out. The lanterns stopped. Every light turned toward the ridge. Then the basin went dark all at once. The next thing Elias remembered was waking alone at the edge of Black Hollow with his lantern extinguished and his companions missing. Search parties found no trace of the 4 men. After that night, Elias Mercer became a different person. He abandoned his surveying work and remained in Black Hollow, helping maintain the church and station. Margaret noticed that he avoided looking east after sunset. In 1888, another change came to the town. The church bell began ringing on its own. Sometimes it sounded once in the middle of the afternoon. Sometimes it rang 9 times before sunset. No one was ever seen pulling the rope. By then, Black Hollow had fewer than 60 residents. The railroad considered closing the station, but freight crews reported unusual delays whenever they attempted to bypass it. One engineer claimed his locomotive lost steam pressure every time he ignored the stop signal. Another said he saw lanterns moving beside the tracks for miles. Then came the autumn of 1891. Margaret wrote her final letter on October 3. The bell has been ringing at strange hours, she wrote. Elias says the valley is preparing for something. Last night the footsteps did not pass through town. They stopped outside my window and remained there until dawn. 3 days later, a freight train passed Black Hollow at midnight. The conductor reported seeing the town fully illuminated. People walked the streets carrying lanterns. Music drifted from the hotel. The church bell rang as the train rolled past. 3 days after that, the same conductor returned eastbound. Black Hollow was empty. The station sign stood beside the track. The water tower remained. But every house, every store, every fence, and every tree within the town limits had vanished. The valley looked untouched, as if no settlement had ever been built there. Railroad officials launched an investigation. Survey maps confirmed the town's existence. Tax records listed property owners. Church documents recorded births and marriages. Yet investigators found only bare earth where Black Hollow should have stood. No bodies were discovered. No building materials were found. Even the foundations were gone. Margaret Hale's letters became public in 1907 after her sister's death. Historians dismissed them as exaggerated frontier stories until a second collection surfaced in 1934. These letters, written by a railroad clerk in Denver, described repeated shipments of supplies to Black Hollow throughout the 1880s and included receipts signed by Elias Mercer. Interest in the vanished town returned. In 1952, a university expedition visited the valley. The researchers found something curious, a circle of unusually dark soil where the church had supposedly stood. Beneath it they uncovered the bronze clapper from a church bell. No bell was ever found. One of the researchers, Professor Daniel Reeves, spent years studying the mystery. He concluded that Black Hollow had existed beyond any reasonable doubt. The question was not whether the town was real, but what happened to it. Reeves died before publishing his final paper. Among his notes was a transcript of an interview with an elderly rancher who claimed to have camped near the valley in 1891. "I heard a bell after midnight," the rancher said. "Then I saw lanterns moving across the hills. By morning there was no town. But the grass was pressed down, like a great crowd had passed through during the night. Today, travelers crossing that part of Colorado will find no sign marked Black Hollow. The railroad station was removed long ago, and the valley appears no different from countless others in the high plains. Yet on rare autumn nights, local ranchers still speak of hearing a distant church bell carried by the wind. Some dismiss it as imagination. Others remember the old stories. And a few claim that if you stand near the eastern ridge after dark and listen carefully, you can hear footsteps moving through a town that no longer appears on any map, keeping time with a bell whose bronze clapper rests beneath the grass of an empty valley. Whether those footsteps belong to memory, legend, or something that still walks the hills of Black Hollow, no one has ever returned with an answer. But the bell, they say, still rings. Continuation, the echo beneath the ridge. For nearly 40 years after Black Hollow vanished, the valley remained undisturbed. Ranchers avoided it after dark, railroad crews passed through quickly, and historians argued over whether the disappearance had been a natural disaster, a mass migration, or an elaborate frontier myth. The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for a young telegraph operator named Thomas Bellamy. In the winter of 1931, Thomas was assigned to a remote rail junction 20 miles west of the old Black Hollow line. The station handled little traffic, and his nights were usually spent listening to the wind rattle the windows. On December 17, shortly after midnight, his telegraph key clicked unexpectedly. The message was weak and uneven. "Stop train before the valley. Stop, the bell is late." Thomas assumed another operator was playing a joke. He checked the line. No station on that branch was active. He sent a reply asking for identification. After several minutes, a second message arrived. Black Hollow Station. Thomas stared at the key until dawn. The line remained silent. The following night, a freight train was scheduled to pass through the valley. Remembering the strange message, Thomas reported it to his supervisor, who dismissed it as electrical interference. The train departed on schedule. It never reached the next station. Search crews found the locomotive standing motionless beside the old Black Hollow marker. The engine was undamaged. Steam still hissed from the boiler. The cargo remained intact. The crew was gone. No footprints led away from the train. No signs of struggle were found. It was as if the engineer, conductor, and brakeman had simply stepped out of existence. Thomas Bellamy resigned a week later, but he could not forget the message. Over the next decade he became obsessed with Black Hollow, collecting newspaper clippings, railroad records, and personal accounts. Eventually he discovered a detail that earlier investigators had overlooked. Every unexplained disappearance connected to the valley had occurred during the same week of December. In 1942, Thomas decided to visit the valley himself. He arrived on December 16 with a tent, a lantern, and a portable telegraph set connected to the abandoned rail line. Snow covered the ground, and the air carried the sharp smell of pine from the distant hills. As evening fell, he found the dark circle of soil where the church had once stood. The bronze clapper recovered by the university expedition years earlier was now displayed in a museum, but the depression in the earth remained. At exactly 9 o'clock, Thomas heard a bell. Not from a church tower. From beneath his feet. The sound rose through the frozen ground, deep and muffled, as though a buried bell had been struck far below the valley. Then came the footsteps. They approached from the eastern ridge in the same steady rhythm described by Elias Mercer decades earlier. Thomas extinguished his lantern and crouched behind a cluster of rocks. Moonlight revealed movement on the hillside. Lanterns. Dozens of them. Figures carrying the lights descended toward the valley in silent lines. Thomas could not make out their faces, only dark silhouettes against the snow. The procession entered the empty town site and stopped where the church had once stood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to glow. A faint amber light spread across the valley floor, tracing invisible outlines beneath the snow. Streets appeared where none existed. Fence lines emerged. The shape of buildings shimmered into view like reflections on water. Black Hollow was returning. Thomas watched in disbelief as houses, shops, and the church slowly materialized in pale light. The lantern-bearing figures moved through the streets as if resuming lives interrupted only hours earlier. Music drifted from the hotel. Smoke rose from chimneys. The town looked exactly as it had in a conductor's report from 1891. Thomas knew he should leave. Instead, driven by the same curiosity that had doomed Elias Mercer, he stepped onto Main Street. The air felt strangely warm inside the glowing town. Snow vanished beneath his boots. A woman in a dark coat passed him carrying a basket of bread, yet she showed no sign of seeing him. Farther down the street, children chased one another around the water tower. Everything seemed real. Then the church bell rang. Every person stopped moving. Slowly, as one, they turned toward Thomas. For the first time he saw their faces. They were ordinary faces. Farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, laborers. But their expressions held the same startled recognition, as if they had suddenly noticed a stranger standing in the middle of their town. An elderly man stepped forward. Thomas recognized him from an old photograph. Elias Mercer. The surveyor looked no older than he had in 1891. "You shouldn't be here," Elias said. His voice sounded distant, like words carried through water. "What is this place?" Thomas asked. Elias glanced toward the eastern ridge. The bell called us back. Back from where? Before Elias could answer, another bell tone echoed beneath the ground. The amber light flickered. Faces in the street changed from curiosity to alarm. You must leave, Elias said urgently. The valley closes before dawn. Thomas backed away, but he could not stop staring. The entire town had begun to dim. Buildings lost their solid edges. Lanterns faded like dying embers. The people were vanishing. Margaret Hale appeared beside the church steps. She looked exactly as she must have looked when she wrote her final letter. "Tell them we were here," she said. Then the bell rang a third time. Darkness swept across Black Hollow. Thomas found himself standing alone in an empty valley under falling snow. The town was gone. His lantern lay at his feet, cold and unlit. When he reached the rail junction 2 days later, he sent a detailed report to the railroad company and later to Professor Daniel Reeves. Neither organization published his account. Officials feared it would provoke panic or ridicule. Thomas kept one piece of evidence. In his coat pocket he found a folded receipt from the Black Hollow General Store dated October 6, 1891, signed by Margaret Hale. The paper was dry and fresh, as though written that morning. Thomas Bellamy died in 1978. Among his possessions was a notebook containing a single final entry. The town still exists somewhere beyond the ridge. The bell does not summon the dead. It summons the town itself. Today the receipt is locked in a private archive, and the valley remains empty. Yet every December, railroad dispatchers along that abandoned line occasionally report a brief signal on the old telegraph frequency. Black Hollow Station. Bell due at 9. The signal lasts only a few seconds before the line goes silent again. And somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, where no town appears on any map, lanterns may still be gathering in the snow, waiting for the bell that calls Black Hollow home. Continuation, the winter signal. After Thomas Bellamy's death, his notebook passed through several hands before reaching his granddaughter, Eleanor Bellamy. Unlike the historians who treated Black Hollow as a curiosity, Eleanor approached it as an unsolved historical event. She worked as an archivist in Denver and spent years cataloging railroad records, weather reports, and private correspondence connected to the vanished town. In 1984 she discovered something hidden inside the back cover of Thomas's notebook, a thin sheet of paper covered with telegraph codes. Most of the messages were routine railroad traffic, but one sequence appeared repeatedly. 9 bells. Gate open. Hold the east road. The phrase appeared in records from 1888, 1891, 1931, and 1942. The dates matched every major incident associated with Black Hollow. Eleanor became convinced that someone, or something, had been communicating through the rail line for decades. That winter she traveled to the valley carrying Thomas's notebook and a portable radio receiver adapted to monitor old telegraph frequencies. Snow covered the plains, and the abandoned track disappeared beneath drifts as she approached the place where the station had once stood. At sunset she found the familiar dark circle of soil and set up camp nearby. The valley was silent except for the wind. At 8:47 p.m., the radio crackled. Bell in 13. Eleanor's hands tightened around the receiver. At exactly 9 o'clock, the buried bell sounded. The tone rolled upward through the frozen earth, deep enough to vibrate in her chest. Then came the footsteps from the eastern ridge. But this time they were accompanied by another sound. A train whistle. Eleanor looked toward the tracks. Moonlight revealed nothing, yet the whistle grew louder. Steel rails began to hum beneath the snow. Out of the darkness emerged a locomotive. It moved silently except for the whistle, its lantern glowing amber rather than white. Frost covered the engine, and the number plate was obscured by ice. Behind it stretched a line of passenger cars that looked decades older than any train still operating in Colorado. The train stopped beside the vanished station. Doors opened. People stepped onto the platform that did not exist. Some wore frontier clothing from the 1880s. Others wore suits from the 1930s. A few were dressed like railroad workers from the early 20th century. They carried no luggage. They walked calmly into the glowing outlines of the town that were beginning to appear across the valley floor. Eleanor recognized one face immediately. Thomas Bellamy. He looked exactly as he had in a photograph taken shortly before his death, not as a young man from 1942. "Grandfather," she whispered. Thomas paused on the platform and turned toward her. His expression held neither surprise nor fear, only a weary sadness. "You came too late," he said. Eleanor stepped closer. "What is happening here?" "The train keeps bringing people back." "Back from where?" Thomas glanced toward the eastern ridge. "From the crossing." Before she could ask another question, the church bell rang again. The amber glow intensified, and black hollow materialized around them. Houses solidified. Windows filled with warm light. The hotel doors opened as music drifted into the cold night. The passengers from the train dispersed through the streets as if returning home after a long journey. Eleanor followed Thomas toward the church. Inside, candles burned along the walls. The pews were filled with townspeople from different decades, all sitting together in complete silence. At the altar stood Elias Mercer. He looked older now, his hair streaked with gray. "Another Bellamy," Elias said when he saw Eleanor. "Tell me what this place is," she demanded. Elias rested a hand on the altar rail. Black Hollow was built where two roads meet. There's only one road into the valley. One road that remains on your maps. The candles flickered. "The night we vanished," Elias continued, "the bell rang 9 times before midnight. The eastern road opened, and the town answered." "Answered what?" Elias's eyes settled on the congregation. "A call we had been hearing for years." Eleanor looked around the church. The people in the pews stared straight ahead, motionless. "Can they leave?" Some tried. "What happened?" Elias did not answer. Outside, the train whistle sounded once. Thomas suddenly gripped Eleanor's arm. "You have to go now. I'm not leaving without understanding this." "You don't understand," he said. "The train departs before the town fades. Then come with me." For a moment hope appeared in his face. Then the bell rang a third time, and the hope vanished. "I can't," he said quietly. The church doors burst open as a freezing wind swept through the building. The candles dimmed. Around them, the congregation began to blur like figures seen through fog. Elias stepped back toward the altar. "The crossing is closing." Thomas pushed Eleanor toward the door. "Run." She stumbled into the street. The town was dissolving. Buildings lost their edges. Lanterns faded. The passenger train had already begun moving. Eleanor ran toward it. The nearest car door stood open. She grabbed the railing and pulled herself aboard just as the train gathered speed. Inside, the car was warm and brightly lit. Rows of passengers sat in silence, facing forward. Some wore clothing from the 19th century, others from the 20th. None acknowledged her. The conductor approached. His uniform was old-fashioned, and a silver pocket watch hung from his vest. "Ticket, please," he said. "I don't have one," Eleanor replied breathlessly. The conductor studied her for a long moment. Then he opened his watch. The hands pointed to 9. "You're on the wrong train," he said. The whistle shrieked. Suddenly the windows filled with darkness. Not night, but a deeper blackness that swallowed the landscape entirely. The car lights flickered. Passengers remained perfectly still. Eleanor felt the train accelerating, faster than any locomotive should have been able to travel. The wheels no longer sounded like steel on rails. They sounded distant, muffled, as if running across an endless hollow beneath the earth. The conductor closed his watch. "When the bell rings again," he said, "don't look out the window." Then he walked away. Eleanor clutched the seat as the train rushed into the darkness beyond the eastern ridge, carrying its silent passengers toward a destination that had never appeared on any railroad timetable. And somewhere behind her, in the fading valley of Black Hollow, the church bell began to ring once more. Continuation, the road beyond the bell. The fourth bell rang while the train was still racing through darkness. Eleanor Bellamy pressed her eyes shut. The conductor's warning echoed in her mind, but curiosity fought against fear. The silence inside the passenger car felt unnatural. No one shifted in their seat. No one coughed. The only sound was the deep rhythmic pulse beneath the floor, like a heartbeat moving through iron. Then the fifth bell rang. The air changed. The warmth inside the car faded, replaced by a cold so sharp that Eleanor could see her breath. A faint light began to leak through the windows despite the conductor's warning. It was not moonlight or daylight. It looked like pale silver mist moving alongside the train. One of the passengers across the aisle slowly turned his head toward the window. His eyes were closed. Yet his face carried an expression of terrible longing. Another passenger did the same. Then another. Within seconds the entire car had turned toward the windows, all with their eyes closed, listening. The sixth bell rang. Eleanor could no longer resist. She opened her eyes and looked outside. The train was no longer traveling through darkness. It was moving across an immense plain covered in silver fog. Parallel tracks stretched endlessly in every direction, crossing and recrossing like a giant web. On distant lines she saw other trains passing through the mist, their lanterns glowing amber. Some were freight engines from the 1880s. Others were sleek locomotives from later decades. A few looked so old they belonged to the earliest years of American railroading. And on every train, passengers sat in silence. Eleanor's breath caught. The plane had no horizon. The tracks disappeared into fog that seemed to swallow distance itself. The seventh bell rang. Immediately every passenger in the car bowed their head. A woman near the front began whispering a prayer Eleanor could not fully hear. The words sounded old, almost biblical. Another passenger gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The conductor returned, walking steadily down the aisle. "You looked," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Then you should know where we are." He sat across from her. "The railroads discovered this place by accident," he said. "Long before Black Hollow existed. Survey crews in the 1850s reported tracks appearing where no line had been built. Some thought they were mirages. Others followed them." "What is this?" Eleanor asked. The conductor glanced toward the window. "A junction." "Between what?" "Between roads that belong to time and roads that do not." Eleanor stared at him, unsure whether she was listening to a ghost, a madman, or something else entirely. "Black Hollow was built too close to one of the crossings," he continued. "For years the bell warned the town. Most ignored it. A few understood. Elias Mercer." The conductor nodded. "He found the crossing during his survey. He believed he could map it. And he couldn't. You cannot map a road that changes every time it is traveled." The eighth bell rang. The train began to slow. Through the window Eleanor saw a station emerging from the fog. It was enormous, far larger than any frontier depot. Iron arches stretched overhead, disappearing into darkness. Dozens of tracks converged beneath the roof. Trains stood waiting at every platform, their lanterns glowing like rows of distant stars. Above the central concourse hung a clock. Its hands pointed to 9. They did not move. The train stopped with a hiss of steam. Passengers rose silently from their seats. "Stay close to me," the conductor said. Eleanor stepped onto the platform and felt solid stone beneath her boots. The station was crowded with travelers from different eras. She saw miners carrying pickaxes, soldiers in Civil War uniforms, women in dresses from the 1920s, and railroad workers from decades she could not identify. Some looked frightened. Others looked resigned. No one spoke above a whisper. At the far end of the concourse stood a row of doors marked with brass numbers. Above them was a sign. Eastern Crossing. A bell rang somewhere deep within the station. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. The conductor's expression hardened. "The station decides who returns." "Returns where?" "Home. If home still exists for them." Before she could ask another question, a uniformed stationmaster approached. His coat was black, and his silver buttons reflected the amber lantern light. "Passenger without a ticket," the stationmaster said. The conductor nodded reluctantly. The stationmaster opened a ledger that looked centuries old. He ran a finger down the page, then looked up at Eleanor. "Eleanor Bellamy," he said. "Descendant of Thomas Bellamy. Arrival recorded. Departure unassigned." "I want to go back to Colorado," she said. The stationmaster closed the ledger. "The valley has already faded. Then send me to Denver. The crossing does not operate according to geography." Cold dread spread through her. Nearby, a whistle sounded. A group of passengers began boarding another train. Among them, Eleanor saw Thomas Bellamy. "Grandfather." Thomas turned. For the first time since she had seen him, his expression changed from sadness to urgency. "Not that train," he shouted. 2 station attendants immediately seized his arms and pulled him away from the platform edge. The stationmaster watched calmly. Passengers must not interfere with assignments. "What assignments?" Eleanor demanded. The stationmaster looked at her for a long moment. "The crossing balances what enters and what leaves." Then he pointed toward a narrow platform at the far end of the station. A small locomotive waited there, its lantern burning white instead of amber. "That train departs at the 9th bell," he said. "If you wish to leave, board it. And if I don't? Then you remain with Black Hollow." The station clock still showed 9. But now a low vibration was moving through the floor. The final bell was about to ring. Eleanor ran. She pushed through the crowd, past silent passengers and rows of waiting trains. Behind her, whistles began sounding across the station. Steam filled the air. The vibration grew stronger. She reached the white lantern locomotive just as the 9th bell rang. The sound shook the entire station. Doors slammed. Engines roared to life. Trains began moving simultaneously along dozens of tracks. Eleanor climbed aboard the white lantern train. The conductor on this train was different. He wore a plain gray coat and carried no watch. "Sit down," he said. "Do not leave your seat until sunrise." "Where is this train going?" "Away from the crossing." The locomotive lurched forward. Through the rear window Eleanor saw the vast station receding into fog. Hundreds of amber lanterns glowed beneath the iron arches. For an instant she thought she saw Elias Mercer standing beside the station clock, watching her departure. Then the mist closed around the train. The journey lasted for hours or minutes, she could not tell which. Outside the windows, shapes moved through the fog, abandoned depots, broken water towers, stretches of track hanging impossibly in empty air. Once she saw an entire train suspended beside them, motionless, its windows dark. Near dawn, exhaustion overcame her. When she opened her eyes again, sunlight filled the car. The train had stopped. She stepped onto a familiar platform. Denver Union Station. Commuters hurried past carrying newspapers and coffee. The noise of ordinary life surrounded her. The gray-coated conductor remained aboard the locomotive. "Wait," Eleanor said. "What about Black Hollow?" The conductor looked toward the morning sky. "Some towns disappear," he said. "Others continue traveling. Will I ever see it again?" "You already have." The whistle blew. Eleanor stepped back as the train pulled away. Within seconds it vanished around a curve in the yard. No one else seemed to notice that its lantern had burned white. For years afterward, Eleanor tried to prove what she had experienced. She searched railroad schedules for the mysterious train and found none. She returned to the Black Hollow Valley several times, but the dark circle of soil had disappeared. The ground looked untouched. Then, in December of 1991, exactly 100 years after the town vanished, a telegraph signal was recorded on an abandoned line outside Denver. Black Hollow Station. Passenger returned. Count remains unchanged. The message lasted 6 seconds before the line went dead. Eleanor never told anyone about the final detail she discovered that same night. When she emptied the pockets of the coat she had worn in the valley, she found a railroad ticket she had never seen before. Printed across the top were the words, "Eastern Crossing. One passage. Valid until next 9th bell." On the back, in faded ink, was a handwritten note. "The valley remembers those who leave." And every December since then, when the wind blows from the east across the Colorado plains, Eleanor has heard a distant church bell somewhere beyond the ridge, counting slowly toward 9. Continuation, the 9th bell returns. Eleanor Bellamy locked the ticket in a small iron box and tried to live as if the crossing had been a nightmare. She continued her work at the archive, attended conferences, and answered historians' questions about Black Hollow with careful neutrality. But every December the same unease returned. Somewhere beyond the ordinary world, a station clock remained frozen at 9. In 1996, 5 years after the centennial signal, another message arrived. The archive maintained an old telegraph line for historical demonstrations. It had not been connected to any active network in decades. On the evening of December 16, while Eleanor was cataloging railroad maps, the key began clicking. Passage still valid. Bell tomorrow. Eleanor felt the room grow cold. She opened the iron box. The ticket was no longer faded. The ink looked fresh, and the words "valid until next 9th bell" had darkened as though recently written. That night she made a decision she had resisted for years. If Black Hollow remembered those who left, then perhaps it also remembered those who returned. She drove to the valley before dawn on December 17. Snow covered the plains, and the eastern ridge stood dark against a gray sky. The place looked completely ordinary. No dark circle marked the church site. No trace of the vanished town remained. Eleanor waited all day. As sunset approached, the wind died. At exactly 9 o'clock, the buried bell rang. But this time the sound came from 2 places at once, beneath the ground and behind her. Eleanor turned. A church stood where there had been empty grass only moments earlier. Its windows glowed with candlelight. Before fear could stop her, she walked to the door and stepped inside. The church was full. Men and women sat silently in the pews, their faces illuminated by flickering candles. At the altar stood Elias Mercer. He looked directly at her. "You came back," he said. "I need answers," Eleanor replied. Elias nodded slowly. "Then listen carefully. The valley will not stay open long." He led her through a side door into a narrow room behind the sanctuary. There, on a wooden table, lay dozens of railroad tickets identical to the one in Eleanor's pocket. Some were yellowed with age. Others looked newly printed. "Every person who leaves receives one," Elias said. "Why?" "Because the crossing is never finished with them." Eleanor picked up a ticket dated October 6, 1891. Another bore the date December 17, 1931. A third carried December 17, 1942. "Thomas Bellamy," she whispered. Elias lowered his head. "He returned more than once. But I saw him on the train." "You saw the last journey he chose." Eleanor stared at him. "Chosen?" Elias walked to the small window. Outside, the streets of Black Hollow glowed amber in the night. "When the town vanished in 1891, he said, we believed we were being taken somewhere else. We were wrong. The crossing gave us a choice." "What choice?" "To remain with the town or to return alone." Eleanor thought of Thomas's sad expression on the platform. "Most stayed." "At first, yes." "Why?" Elias's voice became very quiet. "Because we were told that if enough people left, the town itself would disappear." A bell rang outside. Not the deep buried bell. A smaller bell, like a signal at a station. Elias stiffened. "They've opened the East Road," he said. "Who has?" Instead of answering, he hurried from the room. Eleanor followed him into the church. The congregation was standing now. Every face had turned toward the eastern doors. Through the stained glass windows Eleanor saw lanterns moving down the hillside. Hundreds of them. But these were not the silent townspeople she had seen before. The figures carried railroad lamps and wore dark uniforms. When they reached the church steps, the doors opened by themselves. The station master from the crossing entered. His black coat was dusted with snow, and the silver buttons gleamed in the candlelight. "Elias Mercer," he said. "Your count has fallen again." The church became utterly silent. Eleanor stepped forward. "What count?" The station master looked at her as if noticing her for the first time. "The number required to keep Black Hollow anchored." Elias closed his eyes. "How many are left?" the station master asked. 32, Elias answered. The station master opened his ledger. There were 47 when the town entered the crossing. People chose to leave. And each departure weakens the valley. Eleanor felt a chill. What happens when the count reaches 0? The station master turned a page. Black Hollow becomes a passing train. No one in the church moved. "That's impossible," Eleanor said. "You have already seen trains that do not belong to any railroad," the station master replied. "Some were once towns." Eleanor remembered the silent locomotives crossing the silver plain. "Then let them leave," she said. "Let the town end." A murmur swept through the congregation. Elias looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and relief. "We thought the same thing once," he said. "But the crossing does not destroy what becomes a train. It sends it onward." "To where?" The station master closed the ledger. "Beyond the eastern line." The way he said it made Eleanor realize no one who had gone there had ever returned. Outside, another whistle sounded. The station master turned toward the door. "The transfer train arrives before dawn." Those who choose departure must board it tonight. He looked directly at Eleanor. Your ticket remains valid. Then he walked out into the snow, followed by the lantern-bearing figures. When the doors closed, the church erupted into whispers. An elderly woman approached Elias. "We can't keep doing this," she said. "My husband left 20 years ago. I should have gone with him." A younger man shook his head. "If we all leave, the town disappears." "Maybe it deserves to," someone answered from the back pew. Eleanor realized she was witnessing an argument that had been repeated for more than a century. Elias raised his hand for silence. "Tonight," he said, "each person decides again." One by one, townspeople began leaving the church. Some headed toward the eastern ridge. Others remained in the pews with bowed heads. Elias turned to Eleanor. "You should go back before the road closes." "And you?" He looked around the sanctuary. "I built this town. I've stayed because I believed I owed it that much. Do you still believe that?" Elias did not answer immediately. Finally he said, "I don't know anymore." Another whistle echoed across the valley. Eleanor stepped outside. Black Hollow shimmered beneath falling snow. At the far end of Main Street, a train waited beside the station that had not existed an hour earlier. Its lanterns burned amber, and steam curled into the night. People were boarding. Some carried small bags. Others carried nothing at all. Eleanor felt the ticket in her pocket growing warm. Above the station, the church bell began counting. 1, 2, 3. The sound rolled across the valley as snow drifted through the lantern light. And for the first time since Black Hollow vanished in 1891, its people were preparing to choose whether the town would remain anchored to the crossing, or become one of the endless trains moving through the silver fog beyond the eastern ridge. Continuation, the transfer train. 4. The fourth bell rolled across the valley as Eleanor stood in the snow, staring at the amber-lit train beside the station. 5. Passengers continued boarding. Some climbed the steps with determination. Others hesitated on the platform, looking back at the glowing streets of Black Hollow as though trying to memorize them. 6. Eleanor saw Margaret Hale emerge from the church carrying a small leather satchel. The schoolteacher paused near the station sign and touched the weathered wood with trembling fingers. "I taught 3 generations here," she said softly when she noticed Eleanor. "Or what felt like 3 generations. You're leaving." Margaret looked toward the eastern ridge. "I think I should have left a long time ago. Do you know where the train goes?" A faint smile crossed Margaret's face. "No. And that's what frightens me most." 7. The bell grew louder. Windows across Black Hollow flickered. For an instant, Eleanor saw through the town's glowing surface to something darker beneath, as if the streets were reflections floating over deep water. Elias Mercer appeared beside her. "The valley is thinning," he said. "Because people are leaving?" He nodded. "Every departure loosens the town's hold on this side of the crossing. Then stop them." Elias watched the boarding passengers. "I stopped them for years." "Why?" "Because I believed I was protecting Black Hollow." His voice carried a weariness Eleanor had not heard before. "And now?" Elias looked at the station clock. "Now I'm not sure whether I've been protecting the town or imprisoning it." 8. The final bell had not yet rung, but the train's engine began to hiss impatiently. Steam poured around the wheels. The conductor stood on the platform checking tickets as passengers filed aboard. Eleanor felt her own ticket burning in her pocket. "If I board," she asked, "can I come back?" Elias did not answer immediately. "Thomas came back," she pressed. "Once, Elias said quietly. After that, the crossing changed him. Eleanor remembered her grandfather's sad eyes on the platform. What did he see? Elias's gaze drifted toward the eastern ridge. Enough to understand why some people choose the train. Before Eleanor could ask more, a shout rose from the far end of Main Street. A young man was running toward the station. "Wait," he called. "Don't let it leave." The conductor held up a hand. "The 9th bell is near." The young man reached the platform breathless. "My wife is still at the church." "Then she has chosen to stay." "No," he said desperately. "She's afraid." The conductor's expression did not change. Fear is not the same as choice. The young man turned as if to run back toward the church. And the 9th bell rang. Hashtag the 9th bell. The sound split the night. Every lantern in Black Hollow flared at once. The streets blazed with amber light. Snow suspended in the air seemed to stop falling. The train whistle shrieked. Then the town moved. Not physically. The houses remained where they were. Yet Eleanor felt the entire valley shift sideways, as though Black Hollow were sliding between two worlds. The church doors burst open. Dozens of townspeople emerged, some hurrying toward the station, others turning back in panic. The young man sprinted across the street and disappeared inside. Elias grabbed Eleanor's arm. "Listen to me," he said. "After the 9th bell, the crossing opens fully. If you stay here, you may not find your way back." "Then come with me," Eleanor said. For a moment Elias looked tempted. Then another sound rose from the eastern ridge. Footsteps. Hundreds of them. The silent procession was descending the hills again. But tonight the figures carried no lanterns. They were only moving shadows against the snow. The conductor saw them and swore under his breath. Bored now, he shouted to the remaining passengers. People surged toward the train. Margaret Hale climbed aboard and turned back once, her eyes lingering on the schoolhouse windows glowing across the street. The shadow procession entered the town. As they passed, lanterns dimmed. Frost spread across windows. The amber light began draining from Black Hollow. Elias stepped away from Eleanor. "What are they?" she asked. His face had gone pale. The reason the bell was never meant to be late. The first shadow reached the station platform. The conductor slammed the train door shut. "Eleanor!" Elias shouted. She looked from him to the departing train. The whistle blew again. Then the young man emerged from the church carrying his wife in his arms. "Please," he cried. The conductor hesitated. A shadow figure stepped onto the tracks. The engine lights flickered. "Open it!" Eleanor shouted. The conductor cursed and pulled the door open just as the couple reached the platform. They tumbled inside. The shadow figure turned toward Eleanor. Where its face should have been was only darkness. Elias pushed her toward the train. "Go. Come with us. I can't leave while they're here." The shadows were spreading through the station now, moving soundlessly among the remaining townspeople. Eleanor climbed aboard. The conductor slammed the door. Through the window she saw Elias standing alone on the platform as the train began to move. The shadow figures surrounded him. And then the station vanished into swirling snow. Hashtag beyond the ridge. The train accelerated eastward. Inside the car, passengers sat in stunned silence. The young woman rescued from the church clung to her husband, shaking. Margaret Hale stared out the window without speaking. After several minutes the conductor entered the car. "Is Elias Mercer alive?" Eleanor demanded. The conductor removed his cap. I don't know. What were those things? He looked around the silent passengers. The crossing keeps accounts. Sometimes it sends collectors. No one asked another question. Outside, the snow gave way to silver fog. The train had entered the plain of endless tracks again. But something was different. Where other trains had once moved through the mist, many now stood motionless. Their lanterns were dark. What happened to them? Eleanor asked. The conductor's expression tightened. Some crossings fail. A distant whistle echoed across the plain. Another answered it. Then another. The fog ahead began to glow. Eleanor leaned toward the window. Far in the distance, an entire town was moving across the silver plain on a network of tracks that had not existed moments before. Houses. A church. A water tower. Black Hollow. The town was traveling like a train. Margaret Hale saw it too. Tears filled her eyes. It's already begun, she whispered. The conductor lowered his head. The count fell too low. Eleanor pressed her hand against the glass as the drifting town passed through the fog. For a brief moment she saw the church bell hanging in its tower, glowing amber against the silver mist. Then Black Hollow disappeared into the endless web of tracks beyond the eastern ridge, becoming one more moving light among countless others. And from somewhere deep within the fog, the bell rang once more. Not for a town. Not for a crossing. But for a journey that had no map, no destination, and no final station. Continuation, the town that learned to move. The bell's final note lingered in the silver fog long after Black Hollow vanished from sight. No one in the passenger car spoke. The rescued couple sat together near the rear door, their faces pale. Margaret Hale remained by the window, watching the mist as though she might glimpse the town again. Eleanor could not stop staring at the place where Black Hollow had disappeared. The conductor stood in the aisle with his cap in his hands. What happens now? Eleanor finally asked. He looked toward the fog-shrouded tracks ahead. Now the town learns whether it can survive as a train. And if it can't? The conductor did not answer. #### the moving lights. Hours passed. Or what felt like hours. Time behaved strangely on the silver plain. The train rolled through mist that glowed faintly from beneath, and every so often another line would appear beside them carrying a silent locomotive in the opposite direction. Near what Eleanor guessed was dawn, the young woman rescued from the church approached the conductor. My name is Clara Whitfield, she said quietly. My husband is Jonah Whitfield. We were born in Black Hollow. Are we dead? The conductor's expression softened. No, he said. If you were dead, the crossing would not have offered a ticket. Then what are we? Jonah asked. Passengers. That single word seemed to unsettle them more than any other answer. Margaret Hale turned from the window. How many towns have become trains? The conductor hesitated. More than the railroads ever admitted. You've seen others? Eleanor asked. I've worked the crossing for a long time. Who are you? The conductor looked down at his silver watch, the same watch that had once pointed permanently to 9. I used to be an engineer on the Denver line, he said. In 1878 my train took the wrong track during a blizzard. Eleanor felt a chill. And then? I reached the station beyond the ridge. You never went home? He closed the watch. Home moved on without me. #### the signal in the fog. As the train continued east, a telegraph key mounted near the front of the car began clicking on its own. The conductor stiffened. Transfer incomplete. Black Hollow unstable. Another message followed immediately. Stop, the bell has no tower. The conductor's face drained of color. What does that mean? Eleanor asked. The church bell was the town's anchor, he said. If the tower failed during the transfer. He did not finish. Outside, the fog suddenly brightened. Dozens of amber lights appeared ahead, moving erratically across the plain. They were not on fixed tracks. They drifted through the mist like a scattered constellation. Margaret pressed a hand to the window. Those are our lanterns. As the train drew closer, Eleanor realized the lights belonged to fragments of Black Hollow. A section of Main Street floated across the fog with 3 intact buildings. Farther away she saw the schoolhouse moving alone on a narrow strip of track. Beyond that drifted the hotel, its windows still glowing. The town had broken apart. #### the broken crossing. The conductor pulled a brass lever near the door. The train slowed. Stay inside, he ordered. If the fragments separate completely, they may never find each other again. Can you stop it? Eleanor asked. Not alone. Before anyone could object, he stepped out into the silver fog carrying a lantern. Eleanor watched him disappear between drifting sections of the town. Minutes later, a bell rang somewhere ahead. Then another answered it from farther away. Margaret suddenly stood up. The school bell. What? Eleanor asked. When the church bell failed, the town lost its center. But the school still has a bell. She turned to Jonah and Clara. In Black Hollow, what was the second bell rung for? Jonah frowned. To gather people during emergencies. Margaret's eyes widened. Then the town is trying to gather itself. Without waiting for permission, she opened the car door and stepped into the fog. Margaret! Eleanor shouted. The schoolteacher looked back once. If the town remembers its people, she said, perhaps its people can help it remember itself. Then she disappeared into the mist. #### the schoolhouse. Eleanor could not stay behind. She followed the sound of the ringing bell through the fog until the schoolhouse emerged ahead of her. It stood alone on a narrow stretch of track, drifting slowly across the silver plain. Margaret was already climbing the steps. Inside, desks remained exactly as they had been left a century earlier. Chalk still rested on the blackboard. At the front of the room hung a small brass bell. Margaret seized the rope and rang it. The clear tone echoed across the fog. Almost immediately, another bell answered from the direction of Main Street. Then a third. One by one, bells began ringing from the scattered fragments of Black Hollow. The drifting buildings started turning toward the schoolhouse. Tracks appeared beneath them, forming new connections through the silver mist. Eleanor felt the entire plane tremble. Outside, the conductor emerged from the fog carrying a broken piece of bronze. The church clapper, he said breathlessly. The tower collapsed during the transfer. Margaret rang the school bell again. The fragments moved faster. Main Street slid into alignment with the schoolhouse. The hotel followed. Then the blacksmith shop, the bakery, the doctor's office. Buildings locked together with a grinding sound like rails meeting. For a moment it seemed the town might reassemble. Then a deep whistle echoed across the plain. Everyone froze. Out of the fog came a locomotive larger than any Eleanor had seen before. Its lanterns burned blue instead of amber, and behind it stretched a line of dark passenger cars with no windows. The conductor whispered a single word. Collectors. #### the Blue Lantern Train. The enormous locomotive slowed beside the reforming town. Doors opened along the dark cars. Shadow figures stepped onto the tracks. They were the same beings that had entered Black Hollow after the ninth bell, but here on the silver plain they appeared taller, their edges blurred by the mist. The lead figure approached the schoolhouse. In its hand was a black ledger. "Transfer incomplete," it said in a voice that sounded like many voices speaking together. "Balance required." The conductor stepped in front of Eleanor and Margaret. "The town has chosen movement," he said. "Movement does not erase debt," the figure replied. It opened the ledger. 15 departures. 15 returns required. Clara gasped. "Returns where?" The figure pointed toward the dark passenger cars. "Beyond the eastern line." Jonah backed away. "No." Margaret tightened her grip on the school bell rope. "You can't take them." The figure turned toward her. "The crossing keeps count." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Elias Mercer's voice rang through the fog. "The count is wrong." Everyone turned. Elias emerged from the mist carrying the shattered bronze clapper from the church bell tower. Shadow figures moved behind him, but they did not touch him. "Elias." Eleanor breathed. He walked steadily toward the schoolhouse. 15 left, he said to the collector, but one returned. His eyes met Eleanor's. The Bellamy woman came back to Black Hollow of her own will. The collector's head tilted. "One return acknowledged." "And I remain with the town," Elias continued. "You were never counted among the departures." "Then count me now." Eleanor stared at him. "What are you doing?" Elias handed the broken clapper to Margaret. "A town needs a bell," he said. Then he stepped toward the Blue Lantern train. The collector closed its ledger. "One passage accepted," it said. The other shadow figures withdrew toward the dark cars. "Elias, stop!" Eleanor shouted. He looked back only once. "Black Hollow was my mistake," he said quietly. "Let it be my debt as well." Then he boarded the Blue Lantern train. The doors closed. The locomotive's whistle sounded, deep and mournful. The train moved eastward into the silver fog until its blue lights vanished completely. Hashtag the new bell. Silence settled over the plain. Margaret stared at the broken clapper in her hands. Tears ran down her face. The conductor removed his cap. "He chose the eastern line," he said. "Can anyone come back from there?" Eleanor asked. The conductor looked into the fog where the blue lights had disappeared. "No one I've ever known." Margaret wiped her eyes and lifted the clapper. "Then we honor him properly." Together they carried it into the schoolhouse. The conductor fashioned a temporary bracket from iron fittings, and Margaret suspended the clapper beneath the school bell. When she rang it, the sound changed. It became deeper, richer, carrying an echo of the lost church bell. Across the silver plain, the scattered fragments of Black Hollow began drawing together again. Main Street aligned with the station. The hotel settled beside the bakery. The church tower, though damaged, rose once more above the rooftops. Slowly, the town reassembled itself. Outside, new tracks formed beneath its streets, linking every building into a single moving line. Black Hollow had become a train. But now it had a bell again. As the town began rolling through the silver fog under its own power, the new bell rang from the schoolhouse tower, carrying Elias Mercer's final sacrifice across the endless plain beyond the eastern ridge. Continuation, the town on the rails. When the new bell rang, the silver fog parted around Black Hollow like water around the bow of a ship. The town moved forward on tracks that had not existed moments earlier. Houses trembled gently as wheels hidden beneath the streets began turning. The church tower leaned but remained standing. The station sign swung in the cold mist. Lanterns glowed in every window. For the first time since 1891, Black Hollow was neither anchored to the valley nor scattered across the plain. It was traveling. Eleanor stood on Main Street and felt the motion beneath her boots. "How is this possible?" she asked. The conductor looked up at the rebuilt bell in the schoolhouse tower. "Towns are made of more than wood and stone," he said. "The crossing discovered that long ago." Margaret Hale emerged from the schoolhouse, her hands still trembling from ringing the bell. "Where are we going?" she asked. The conductor's expression grew distant. "That depends on whether the town chooses a destination. ##### the map of lost stations." As Black Hollow rolled through the fog, the conductor led Eleanor, Margaret, Jonah, and Clara into the station office. The room looked exactly as it must have looked in the 1880s. Telegraph keys rested on the counter. Timetables hung on the wall. A potbelly stove glowed with warm coals. From a locked drawer the conductor removed a folded map. When he spread it across the desk, Eleanor realized it was unlike any railroad map she had ever seen. Lines crossed entire regions where no tracks had existed. Stations were marked with names she had never heard: Ashmere, Hollow Creek, St. Elmo Junction, Greywater. Some names were circled in red ink. Others were crossed out. At the center of the map, written in careful script, was Black Hollow. "What are these places?" Eleanor asked. "Lost stations," the conductor said. "Some were towns that vanished. Some were trains that never arrived. A few still move through the crossing." He pointed to a red circle far east of Black Hollow. "This is where the Blue Lantern train was headed." "The Eastern Line?" The conductor nodded. "What's there?" Jonah asked. "No one knows. The collectors never return." Eleanor's eyes found another mark on the map. "Denver Union, active return gate." "There's a way back," she said. The conductor was silent for a long moment. "For passengers," he said. "Not for a moving town. #### the passenger vote." Word spread quickly through Black Hollow that the town was traveling. By evening, nearly every remaining resident had gathered outside the station. Some wanted to search for a return gate. Others feared the collectors would come again if they stopped. An elderly blacksmith spoke first. "I've spent 100 years listening to that bell," he said. "I'd rather keep moving than hear it call us back to the valley." A farmer shook his head. "And move where? We don't even know if there's a destination." Clara Whitfield stepped forward. "Elias gave himself so we could choose. We should make one." Margaret looked at Eleanor. "You've seen the world beyond the crossing. What would you do?" Eleanor hesitated. Part of her wanted to find the Denver return gate and escape this impossible journey. Another part could not ignore the people around her. Black Hollow was no longer just a mystery from the archives. It was a community trying to survive. "If we can find a return gate," she said carefully, "the passengers who want to leave should have that chance. But the town should decide whether it keeps traveling." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The conductor climbed onto the station platform. "Then we take a vote," he said. "Return west, continue east, or search the crossing for another road." By lantern light, the townspeople cast their choices. When the count was finished, the result surprised everyone. Continue east, 14. Return west, 11. Search the crossing, 7. Black Hollow had chosen to keep moving. #### the signal tower. Near midnight, the telegraph key in the station office began clicking rapidly. Unauthorized movement detected. Black Hollow off schedule. Report destination. The conductor did not answer. The key clicked again. Collector dispatch pending. Margaret's face paled. They found us. Not yet, the conductor said. They only know the town is moving. He folded the map and pointed through the window. Ahead, rising from the fog, stood a tall iron structure beside the tracks. Signal Tower 7, he said. If we reach it first, we can change our route. Before the collectors arrive? Eleanor asked. That depends on how fast Black Hollow can travel. #### the race through the fog. The conductor pulled a brass lever in the station office. A whistle sounded somewhere beneath the town. Black Hollow accelerated. Lanterns swayed in the windows. The tracks beneath Main Street blurred into silver lines. Outside, the fog rushed past like storm clouds. Then another whistle answered from behind them. Blue. Eleanor turned. Far back in the mist, two cold blue lanterns had appeared. The collectors were coming. Jonah gripped the station counter. Can they catch us? If they reach the town before the route changes, the conductor said, they can board. Clara whispered, and take more passengers. The blue lights grew larger. Signal Tower 7 loomed ahead, its iron framework stretching into the fog. A single white lantern burned near the top. Get ready, the conductor said. When we pass the tower, ring the bell. Margaret hurried to the schoolhouse rope. The tower approached. The Blue Lantern train closed the distance behind them. As Black Hollow drew level with the tower, the conductor threw the route lever. Nothing happened. The tracks ahead remained fixed eastward. Again. Eleanor shouted. He pulled harder. Still nothing. Above them, the white lantern in the tower flickered out. A shadow figure stepped onto the tower platform. Too late, the conductor breathed. #### the last switch. The collector train was almost upon them now. Its blue lanterns cast icy light across the rear buildings of Black Hollow. Margaret rang the bell. The deep tone rolled through the town. Windows brightened. Lanterns flared. The tracks beneath Black Hollow trembled. The shadow figure in the tower raised a black flag. And suddenly the rails ahead split into three directions. West. East. A narrow line descending into a valley of silver mist. The conductor stared. That route isn't on the map. The collector train's whistle shrieked behind them. Eleanor looked at the unknown track, then at the blue lights closing in. Take the new line, she said. We don't know where it goes. We know where the others lead. For one heartbeat, the conductor hesitated. Then he threw the switch. Black Hollow lurched violently as the town left the eastbound line and plunged onto the unmarked track. Behind them, the collector train thundered past the junction and vanished into the eastern fog. The blue whistle faded. Silence returned. Slowly, Black Hollow descended into the silver valley beneath the crossing. On the tower platform, the shadow figure lowered the black flag and disappeared into mist. The conductor unfolded the map one more time. Where the new track should have been, there was only blank paper. Then, before their eyes, fresh ink began appearing across the page. Black Hollow, route uncharted. Eleanor looked through the station window as the unknown line carried the town deeper into the glowing fog. Somewhere ahead, beyond every recorded station and every mapped crossing, a road was opening that had never existed before. And for the first time since the bell first rang beneath the Colorado Valley, Black Hollow was traveling a route no collector, conductor, or railroad had ever seen. Continuation, the town on the rails. When the new bell rang, the silver fog parted around Black Hollow like water around the bow of a ship. The town moved forward on tracks that had not existed moments earlier. Houses trembled gently as wheels hidden beneath the streets began turning. The church tower leaned but remained standing. The station sign swung in the cold mist. Lanterns glowed in every window. For the first time since 1891, Black Hollow was neither anchored to the valley nor scattered across the plain. It was traveling. Eleanor stood on Main Street and felt the motion beneath her boots. "How is this possible?" she asked. The conductor looked up at the rebuilt bell in the schoolhouse tower. "Towns are made of more than wood and stone," he said. "The crossing discovered that long ago." Margaret Hale emerged from the schoolhouse, her hands still trembling from ringing the bell. "Where are we going?" she asked. The conductor's expression grew distant. "That depends on whether the town chooses a destination. #### the map of lost stations." As Black Hollow rolled through the fog, the conductor led Eleanor, Margaret, Jonah, and Clara into the station office. The room looked exactly as it must have looked in the 1880s. Telegraph keys rested on the counter. Timetables hung on the wall. A potbelly stove glowed with warm coals. From a locked drawer the conductor removed a folded map. When he spread it across the desk, Eleanor realized it was unlike any railroad map she had ever seen. Lines crossed entire regions where no tracks had existed. Stations were marked with names she had never heard: Ashmere, Hollow Creek, St. Elmo Junction, Greywater. Some names were circled in red ink. Others were crossed out. At the center of the map, written in careful script, was Black Hollow. "What are these places?" Eleanor asked. "Lost stations," the conductor said. "Some were towns that vanished. Some were trains that never arrived. A few still move through the crossing." He pointed to a red circle far east of Black Hollow. "This is where the Blue Lantern train was headed." "The Eastern Line?" The conductor nodded. "What's there?" Jonah asked. "No one knows. The collectors never return." Eleanor's eyes found another mark on the map. "Denver Union, active return gate." "There's a way back," she said. The conductor was silent for a long moment. "For passengers," he said. "Not for a moving town." ###the passenger vote. Word spread quickly through Black Hollow that the town was traveling. By evening, nearly every remaining resident had gathered outside the station. Some wanted to search for a return gate. Others feared the collectors would come again if they stopped. An elderly blacksmith spoke first. "I've spent 100 years listening to that bell," he said. "I'd rather keep moving than hear it call us back to the valley." A farmer shook his head. "And move where? We don't even know if there's a destination." Clara Whitfield stepped forward. "Elias gave himself so we could choose. We should make one." Margaret looked at Eleanor. "You've seen the world beyond the crossing. What would you do?" Eleanor hesitated. Part of her wanted to find the Denver return gate and escape this impossible journey. Another part could not ignore the people around her. Black Hollow was no longer just a mystery from the archives. It was a community trying to survive. "If we can find a return gate," she said carefully, "the passengers who want to leave should have that chance. But the town should decide whether it keeps traveling." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The conductor climbed onto the station platform. "Then we take a vote," he said. "Return west, continue east, or search the crossing for another road." By lantern light, the townspeople cast their choices. When the count was finished, the result surprised everyone. Continue east, 14. Return west, 11. Search the crossing, 7. Black Hollow had chosen to keep moving. ###the signal tower. Near midnight, the telegraph key in the station office began clicking rapidly. Unauthorized movement detected. Black Hollow off schedule. Report destination. The conductor did not answer. The key clicked again. Collector dispatch pending. Margaret's face paled. They found us. Not yet, the conductor said. They only know the town is moving. He folded the map and pointed through the window. Ahead, rising from the fog, stood a tall iron structure beside the tracks. Signal Tower 7, he said. If we reach it first, we can change our route. Before the collectors arrive? Eleanor asked. That depends on how fast Black Hollow can travel. #### The race through the fog. The conductor pulled a brass lever in the station office. A whistle sounded somewhere beneath the town. Black Hollow accelerated. Lanterns swayed in the windows. The tracks beneath Main Street blurred into silver lines. Outside, the fog rushed past like storm clouds. Then another whistle answered from behind them. Blue. Eleanor turned. Far back in the mist, two cold blue lanterns had appeared. The collectors were coming. Jonah gripped the station counter. Can they catch us? If they reach the town before the route changes, the conductor said, they can board. Clara whispered, and take more passengers. The blue lights grew larger. Signal Tower 7 loomed ahead, its iron framework stretching into the fog. A single white lantern burned near the top. Get ready, the conductor said. When we pass the tower, ring the bell. Margaret hurried to the schoolhouse rope. The tower approached. The Blue Lantern train closed the distance behind them. As Black Hollow drew level with the tower, the conductor threw the route lever. Nothing happened. The tracks ahead remained fixed eastward. Again. Eleanor shouted. He pulled harder. Still nothing. Above them, the white lantern in the tower flickered out. A shadow figure stepped onto the tower platform. Too late, the conductor breathed. #### The last switch. The collector train was almost upon them now. Its blue lanterns cast icy light across the rear buildings of Black Hollow. Margaret rang the bell. The deep tone rolled through the town. Windows brightened. Lanterns flared. The tracks beneath Black Hollow trembled. The shadow figure in the tower raised a black flag. And suddenly the rails ahead split into three directions. West. East. A narrow line descending into a valley of silver mist. The conductor stared. That route isn't on the map. The collector train's whistle shrieked behind them. Eleanor looked at the unknown track, then at the blue lights closing in. Take the new line, she said. We don't know where it goes. We know where the others lead. For one heartbeat, the conductor hesitated. Then he threw the switch. Black Hollow lurched violently as the town left the eastbound line and plunged onto the unmarked track. Behind them, the collector train thundered past the junction and vanished into the eastern fog. The blue whistle faded. Silence returned. Slowly, Black Hollow descended into the silver valley beneath the crossing. On the tower platform, the shadow figure lowered the black flag and disappeared into mist. The conductor unfolded the map one more time. Where the new track should have been, there was only blank paper. Then, before their eyes, fresh ink began appearing across the page. Black Hollow, route uncharted. Eleanor looked through the station window as the unknown line carried the town deeper into the glowing fog. Somewhere ahead, beyond every recorded station and every mapped crossing, a road was opening that had never existed before. And for the first time since the bell first rang beneath the Colorado Valley, Black Hollow was traveling a route no collector, conductor, or railroad had ever seen. Continuation, the uncharted line. The unknown track descended through the Silver Valley in a slow, spiraling curve. Behind them, the junction disappeared into fog, taking the collector train with it. Ahead, the rails glowed faintly as if lit from beneath. Black Hollow moved more quietly now. The hidden wheels beneath its streets no longer thundered against the track. Instead, the town seemed to glide. Eleanor stood beside the station window while the conductor studied the map. Fresh ink continued spreading across the blank paper. Route uncharted. Access restricted. Destination unknown. Then the writing stopped. "I've never seen the map change on its own," the conductor said. Margaret Hale looked out toward the valley below. "Perhaps no one has ever brought a town this way." The conductor folded the map carefully. "That may not be a good thing. ##### the Valley of Signals." As dawn approached, the silver fog began to thin. What emerged beyond the windows made every passenger fall silent. The valley was filled with signal towers. Hundreds of them rose from the mist, stretching as far as Eleanor could see. Some were made of iron, others of weathered wood, and a few looked impossibly ancient, built from stone blocks darkened by age. Each tower carried a lantern. Most lanterns were dark. A handful burned white. One burned blue. "This place isn't on any railroad map," Jonah whispered. "No," the conductor said. "It's beneath them." As Black Hollow passed the nearest tower, a telegraph key somewhere in the station office began clicking furiously. "Identify. Identify. Identify." The conductor did not answer. A second tower lit its white lantern. Then a third. One by one, towers throughout the valley awakened. Margaret tightened her grip on the bell rope. "They know we're here." "They're asking who we are," the conductor replied. "Shouldn't we tell them?" Clara asked. The conductor looked toward the glowing towers. "I don't know who's listening. ###the Keeper of Tower 9. Near midday, Black Hollow slowed beside a stone signal tower marked with the number 9. Unlike the others, its lantern burned steadily white. An old man stood on the platform waiting for them. He wore a long gray coat and carried a signal flag tucked beneath one arm. His beard was white, but his eyes were sharp. "You've brought a town," he said as the conductor stepped onto the platform. "So it seems," the conductor replied. The old man studied Black Hollow with open astonishment. "I've watched this valley for 40 years and never seen one survive the descent." Eleanor joined them. "Who are you?" "Gideon Vale," he said. "Keeper of Tower 9. His gaze lingered on the rebuilt bell in the schoolhouse tower. "Interesting," he murmured. "You replaced the anchor." "With a school bell," Margaret said. Gideon nodded approvingly. "That explains why the town is still coherent. Can you tell us where this route leads?" Eleanor asked. The keeper's expression became grave. "If I could, I would have signaled you to turn back." "Why?" He pointed deeper into the valley. "Because the uncharted line ends at the archive. #### the archive." The word sent a strange shiver through Eleanor. "What is the archive?" she asked. Gideon looked at the conductor before answering. "Every station, every train, every town that passes through the crossing leaves a record. Most records remain on the surface. Others are stored below." "Stored by whom?" Jonah asked. The keeper glanced at the white lantern above his tower. "By those who built the crossing." "The collectors?" Clara whispered. "No," Gideon said. "The collectors enforce the rules. The archivists write them." The conductor's face darkened. "I thought the archive was a legend." "So did I," Gideon replied. Until I saw its lights 3 winters ago. He lowered his voice. If Black Hollow reaches the archive, the archivists will decide whether the town remains a town. And if they decide otherwise? Eleanor asked. Gideon looked toward the endless rows of dark signal towers. Then your town becomes a permanent record. Meaning? Meaning it stops moving. Hashtag the hidden passenger. Before anyone could speak again, a shout came from Main Street. Someone's here. Eleanor and the others hurried back into town. A crowd had gathered near the hotel. Standing in the middle of the street was a man in a dark railroad uniform. Blue lantern light glimmered faintly on his coat. The conductor swore. Collector. But the man raised both hands. I'm not here to take anyone, he said. His voice was ordinary, tired, human. Then why are you here? Eleanor demanded. He removed his cap. Because I was left behind. Up close, Eleanor saw that he was not a shadow figure at all. He was flesh and blood. My name is Samuel Reed, he said. I worked the Blue Lantern train. The crowd murmured uneasily. What happened? Gideon asked. Samuel looked toward the valley. When Black Hollow took the uncharted line, the collectors lost your signal. The train overshot the junction. So you followed us? The conductor asked. Samuel nodded. To warn you. About the archive? About what's waking there. Hashtag the forgotten bell. That evening, Samuel told his story in the church. Years earlier, he had boarded a collector train as a passenger. Instead of being sent beyond the Eastern Line, he had been recruited to serve the crossing. The collectors aren't all shadows, he explained. Some of us were travelers who stayed too long. And the archivists? Eleanor asked. Samuel's hands trembled slightly. I only saw them once. They live beneath the archive where the oldest tracks meet. What's waking? Margaret asked. Samuel looked toward the bell tower. The first bell. The church fell silent. There was a bell before Black Hollows, he continued. Before the railroads. The crossing was built around it. When towns vanish, a little of that bell sound returns to the archive. Gideon slowly removed his glasses. You're saying the uncharted line is feeding the source? Samuel nodded. And Black Hollow is carrying a replacement bell made from the original clapper. Eleanor suddenly understood why the map had marked their route as restricted. They were bringing part of the original bell back to the place where the crossing began. Hashtag the vote at midnight. Near midnight, the townspeople gathered again outside the station. The school bell glowed softly above them. Gideon addressed the crowd first. If you continue to the archive, the archivists may take the town. Samuel added, if you turn back now, the collectors will eventually find you. And if we keep moving? Jonah asked. Then you may reach the first bell before either side is ready, Samuel said. Eleanor looked around at the faces illuminated by lantern light. These people had already survived disappearance, exile, and transformation. Margaret stepped forward. For a century, she said, Black Hollow has been reacting to the crossing. Tonight we decide whether the crossing reacts to us. She pointed toward the uncharted valley. I say we go forward. One by one, others nodded. The blacksmith. Clara. Jonah. Gideon after a long hesitation. Finally the conductor looked at Eleanor. And you? Eleanor thought of her grandfather, of Elias Mercer disappearing into the Blue Lantern train, of the endless silver plain filled with lost stations. If the first bell is calling us, she said, I want to know why. ###. The descent continues. The conductor climbed into the station office and pulled the throttle lever. Black Hollow shuddered. The hidden wheels beneath the streets began turning once more. Outside, the signal towers watched with their white lanterns as the town resumed its journey down the uncharted line. Far ahead in the valley, beyond the reach of ordinary sight, a faint golden glow appeared in the fog. Gideon stared at it and whispered, "The archive." At the same moment, the rebuilt bell in the schoolhouse tower rang once by itself. Not a warning. Not a signal. A greeting. And deep beneath the tracks, somewhere below the Silver Valley, another bell answered from the darkness for the first time in generations. Continuation, the archive beneath the tracks. The answering bell rolled through the valley like distant thunder. Every lantern in Black Hollow flickered. The hidden wheels beneath the streets slowed for a moment, then resumed turning. Far ahead, the golden glow in the fog brightened. "It heard us," Samuel Reed whispered. Gideon Vale stared into the mist with the expression of a man watching a legend become real. "No," he said quietly. "It recognized us." ###. The descent. The uncharted line began sloping downward more steeply. Signal towers thinned out until only a few remained, their white lanterns watching from distant ridges. The fog changed color from silver to pale gold. Tracks appeared and disappeared beside them like half-remembered roads. Inside the station office, the telegraph key started clicking again. Archive awake. Unscheduled arrival. Prepare record. The conductor did not reply. Eleanor noticed that his hands were shaking. "You're afraid," she said. He gave a humorless laugh. "I spent decades believing the archive was a story told to frighten new conductors. Stories are easier to ignore than places." Margaret Hale stood beside the map, watching the fresh ink spread across the page. New symbols were appearing ahead of Black Hollow's route, circles connected by lines, each marked with a small bell. "What do they mean?" she asked. Gideon leaned over the map. His face went pale. "Those are founding bells," he said. "The crossings where vanished towns were first anchored." "How many are there?" Clara asked. Gideon counted silently. 9. The church bell rang once above them. Everyone looked up. #### The Hall of Bells. Near midnight, Black Hollow emerged from the fog onto a vast circular platform of black stone. The town stopped moving. Beyond the platform rose an immense structure built directly into the valley wall. It resembled a railway station and a cathedral at the same time. Arches of iron and stone climbed into darkness. Tracks entered the building through 9 separate gates. Above the central entrance hung a single word carved into bronze. ####. Archive. The golden glow came from within. "We've arrived," Samuel said. The great doors opened by themselves. No guards appeared. No collectors emerged. Only silence. The conductor swallowed hard. "I don't like this." "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted. But the rebuilt bell in the schoolhouse tower began ringing softly, as if urging them forward. Together, Eleanor, Margaret, Gideon, Samuel, Jonah, Clara, and the conductor walked toward the entrance. Inside, the archive was far larger than the exterior suggested. A circular hall stretched before them, lined with towering shelves filled not with books but with railroad ledgers, station signs, telegraph tapes, clocks, tickets, and weathered photographs. Above the shelves hung 9 enormous bells suspended from iron beams. 8 were dark bronze. The 9th glowed faintly gold. "The founding bells," Gideon breathed. In the center of the hall stood a round table. Upon it rested an open ledger larger than a coffin. Its pages were turning by themselves. ####, the archivist. A figure stepped out from between the shelves. Unlike the collectors, it was not a shadow. It appeared as a woman in a long dark coat, with silver hair tied behind her neck and a brass key hanging from a chain at her waist. Her eyes reflected the golden light of the hall. "Black Hollow," she said. 105 years overdue. The conductor instinctively removed his cap. "You're an archivist," he said. She inclined her head. "Mara Voss," she said. "Keeper of the Ninth Ledger." Eleanor stepped forward. "Why was our town brought here?" Mara looked toward the glowing bell above them. "Because Black Hollow carries a fragment of the first bell." Margaret's hand tightened around the broken bronze clapper hanging from her belt. "This?" "Yes," Mara said. "When the original bell was shattered, pieces of its sound became anchors for the crossings. Most were lost. One remained in your valley." Samuel frowned. "Then the collectors were trying to recover it." "Recover?" Mara's expression sharpened. "No. They were trying to prevent it from returning." Silence filled the hall. "Prevent it?" Eleanor repeated. Mara turned a page in the Great Ledger. "The first bell does not merely summon towns," she said. "It wakes roads that should remain closed." ####, the closed road. Mara led them deeper into the archive. Behind the Hall of Bells lay a long chamber where abandoned tracks ended at a sealed bronze door. The door was covered in symbols that resembled intertwined rail lines. A faint vibration came from the other side. "This is the 10th gate," Mara said. Gideon stared at it in horror. "I thought there were only 9 crossings." "There are 9 safe crossings," Mara replied. "What's behind the 10th? Jonah asked. Mara looked at the sealed door for a long moment. "The original route." "To where?" Clara whispered. "To the place the railroads found before they learned how to build the crossings." Samuel took a step back. "The eastern source." Mara nodded once. "The collectors exist because that road was never meant to open again." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her chest. "And Black Hollow can open it?" Mara's gaze shifted to the bronze clapper at Margaret's belt. "The fragment carries the first bell's resonance. If it is reunited with the golden bell in the Hall of Bells, the 10th gate may awaken. ##### the bargain. They returned to the central hall. Mara Voss closed the Great Ledger. "You have 2 choices," she said. "What choices?" Eleanor asked. "Leave the fragment with the archive and Black Hollow will be granted a stable route through the crossings. The collectors will not pursue you." Margaret looked relieved. "Or?" the conductor asked. Mara's eyes reflected the golden bell overhead. "Reunite the fragment with the first bell and discover what lies beyond the 10th gate." Jonah let out a nervous laugh. "That doesn't sound like a choice sane people make." "No," Mara agreed. "It sounds like the choice that created Black Hollow." Eleanor looked at the townspeople gathered around the hall. For a century they had been carried by forces they did not understand. Now, for the first time, someone was offering them control. "What would happen if we leave the fragment here?" she asked. Mara answered immediately. "The school bell will become an ordinary bell. The town will continue traveling, but it will never return to the valley, and it will never reach the 10th gate." Margaret touched the bronze clapper. "And Elias Mercer's sacrifice?" Mara's expression softened. "Would keep Black Hollow alive." The hall fell silent. Then the golden bell above them rang. Once. The sound was unlike any bell Eleanor had heard. It seemed to come from every direction at once. The sealed bronze door in the distant chamber answered with a low rumble. Mara looked upward sharply. "It hasn't rung in 73 years, she whispered. The golden bell rang again. This time the vibration shook dust from the shelves. In the distance, something heavy shifted behind the 10th gate. Hashtag the name in the ledger. The great ledger on the table began turning pages rapidly. Ink spread across a blank sheet. Eleanor stepped closer. At the top of the page appeared a new entry. Black Hollow. Status, unresolved. Final keeper, Elias Mercer. Then another line formed beneath it. Return pending. Margaret gasped. Samuel stared at the words. That's impossible. Mara Voss did not look surprised. No passage beyond the eastern line has ever returned, the conductor said. Mara closed the ledger slowly. Then perhaps, she said, Elias Mercer did not go where the collectors intended. At that moment, a distant whistle echoed through the archive. Not blue. Not white. Amber. Every bell in the hall began to vibrate. And somewhere beyond the sealed 10th gate, a train was approaching. Continuation, the train behind the 10th gate. The amber whistle echoed through the archive a second time. Every bell in the hall vibrated in answer. Dust drifted from the iron beams overhead, and the great ledger on the central table fluttered open by itself. Mara Voss went completely still. That whistle shouldn't exist, she whispered. The conductor looked toward the distant chamber where the sealed bronze door stood. You said no one returns from beyond the eastern line. I said no passage has ever returned, Mara replied. A whistle is not a passage. Another rumble shook the floor. From behind the 10th gate came the unmistakable sound of wheels moving slowly over rails. Hashtag the sealed chamber. Mara turned and walked quickly toward the chamber of the bronze door. The others followed. As they entered, the vibration grew stronger. The symbols covering the door were glowing faintly gold. The gate is waking, Gideon said. It's being called, Samuel corrected. Eleanor stepped closer. Through a narrow seam between the bronze panels she could see darkness beyond, but not ordinary darkness. It shifted like deep water. The amber whistle sounded again, much nearer now. Then a voice came through the seam. Open the gate. Margaret staggered backward. Elias, she whispered. The conductor's face drained of color. That's impossible. Open the gate, the voice repeated, calm and clear. Mara placed both hands on the bronze door. Elias Mercer, she called, identify your route. For a moment there was only the sound of distant wheels. Then the answer came. Route 0. The chamber fell silent. Gideon looked at Mara in horror. There is no Route 0. There wasn't, Mara said quietly. Hashtag the hidden entry. Back in the Hall of Bells, the great ledger was still turning pages. Mara hurried to it and began searching through ancient entries written in faded ink. What are you looking for? Eleanor asked. The original survey, Mara replied. She stopped at a page so old the edges had become brittle. At the top was a heading. Preliminary record, Eastern source. Beneath it, in a different hand, was a note added years later. Route 0 sealed after first expedition failed to return. Another line followed. One engine unaccounted for. Samuel leaned over the page. An engine survived. Mara nodded slowly. Apparently it never stopped traveling. And Elias found it? Eleanor asked. Or it found him. Hashtag the bargain of the gate. The amber whistle came again, now loud enough to rattle the windows of the archive. Mara closed the ledger. If that train is truly on Route 0, opening the gate could expose every crossing to the original line. Then don't open it, Jonah said immediately. Margaret looked toward the chamber. Elias is out there. Or something. Using his voice, the conductor warned. Eleanor felt the ticket in her pocket grow warm. What happens if we leave the gate closed? She asked. Mara answered without hesitation. The train will continue calling. Eventually the gate may open on its own. And if we open it now? We control the crossing. Samuel shook his head. Barely. The bell in the schoolhouse tower rang once. Then the golden bell overhead answered. The two tones merged into a single resonant note that rolled through the archive like a command. Mara looked at Margaret. The fragment is responding, she said. The gate won't stay sealed much longer. Hashtag opening the 10th gate. They returned to the bronze door. The symbols across its surface were now shining brightly. The seam between the panels had widened enough to reveal a line of amber light beyond. Mara placed her hand on the door. Once this opens, she said, the crossing may never be the same. Neither is Black Hollow, Eleanor replied. Mara studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. She inserted the brass key from her belt into a hidden lock beneath the glowing symbols. The key turned with a sound like a distant signal lever. The bronze door began to open. Cold air rushed into the chamber carrying the smell of rain, smoke, and something older than either. Beyond the gate lay a vast tunnel lit by amber lanterns. And on the track inside stood a locomotive unlike any they had seen. Its engine was black iron streaked with silver. The number plate on the front read 0. Elias Mercer stood beside it. Hashtag Route 0. He looked older than before. His hair was almost white, and his coat was worn by weather that did not belong to any Colorado season. Yet his eyes were clear. You opened it, he said. Margaret took an involuntary step forward. Elias. He smiled faintly. I was hoping you would. The conductor stared at the locomotive. That's the missing engine from the first expedition. Elias nodded. Where have you been? Eleanor asked. On the road the crossings were built to avoid. He placed a hand on the side of the engine. This train has been traveling since before Black Hollow existed. The collectors sent me beyond the eastern line, but Route 0 found me before the source did. The source? Mara asked. Elias looked at her with recognition. Archivist Voss. I wondered if the archive still stood. Answer the question, she said. Elias's expression became grave. The crossings were built to divert traffic away from the source. But the source is waking. The floor trembled. Far down the tunnel, beyond the reach of the lanterns, a deep golden glow pulsed once. Every bell in the archive rang simultaneously. Hashtag the first bell. Elias stepped aside and pointed into the darkness. The first bell isn't in the Hall of Bells, he said. That golden bell is only an echo. Another pulse of light rolled through the tunnel. The real bell is down there, Elias continued. At the source. Samuel backed away from the gate. No one goes to the source. People do, Elias said quietly. They just don't come back. Margaret looked from Elias to the glowing tunnel. Why return now? Elias's gaze settled on the rebuilt bell fragment hanging at her belt. Because Black Hollow carries the missing piece. Mara's face tightened. The clapper. Elias nodded. The first bell cannot fully awaken without it. The collectors feared the fragment would return to the source. The archivists feared what would happen if it did. Eleanor felt a sudden realization. And you? Elias looked into the tunnel where the golden light pulsed again. I'm afraid of what happens if it doesn't. #### the choice of Black Hollow. The chamber filled with the sound of distant ringing. Outside, beyond the archive walls, Black Hollow waited on its moving tracks. Inside, the 10th gate stood open for the first time in generations. Mara Voss faced the townspeople. If the fragment returns to the source, the first bell may awaken. The crossings could change forever. And if we refuse? Jonah asked. Elias answered. Then the source will keep calling. Eventually every route will lead here. Silence followed. Margaret slowly removed the bronze clapper from her belt. The metal was warm. The golden glow deep in the tunnel brightened in response. Elias extended his hand. Come with me, he said. Margaret looked at Eleanor. You opened the gate, she said softly. What do we do now? Eleanor stared into the endless tunnel of Route Zero. Somewhere ahead, beyond the amber lanterns and the pulsing light, the real first bell was waiting. And for the first time since the Colorado Valley disappeared in 1891, Black Hollow stood at the threshold not of another crossing, but of the place where all crossings began. The next step would not decide where the town traveled. It would decide what the crossings became. Continuation, the source of the bell. For a long moment, no one moved. The bronze clapper rested in Margaret Hale's hands, glowing faintly in the golden light pouring from Route Zero. Deep within the tunnel, the unseen first bell pulsed again, and every lantern in the archive dimmed in answer. Elias Mercer kept his hand extended. If the source is calling for the fragment, Gideon said carefully, perhaps we should give it what it wants. That assumes the source wants anything, Mara Voss replied. A bell does not think. Elias looked back into the tunnel. After 40 years on Route Zero, I'm not certain that's true. #### the decision. Margaret closed her fingers around the clapper. I've spent a century listening to bells, she said quietly. Warnings, summons, farewells. This is the first one that sounds lonely. She stepped toward Elias. I'm going with him. Jonah opened his mouth to protest, but Clara touched his arm. She's right, Clara said. We came this far because the bell kept calling. Eleanor looked at Mara. If they go, can the rest of us stay here? Mara's gaze shifted to the open gate. The moment the fragment enters the source, every crossing will feel it. There may not be a here in the same way afterward. Samuel Reed swallowed hard. Then someone should witness what happens. The conductor let out a slow breath. I've spent my life following tracks laid by other people. I'd rather see where the first one began. One by one, they made their choice. Eleanor. Margaret. Elias. The conductor. Samuel. Gideon after a long hesitation. Jonah and Clara remained behind with Mara and the other townspeople. If the crossings change, Jonah said, Black Hollow will need someone to keep the town together. Margaret embraced Clara briefly, then turned toward the tunnel. #### Route Zero. The locomotive marked Zero waited silently on the track. Elias climbed into the cab and lit the engine's amber lantern. The glow spread through the tunnel, revealing walls lined with ancient signal markings unlike any railroad code. The group boarded the first passenger car. As the train began moving, the 10th gate slowly closed behind them. Mara Voss stood in the narrowing gap. If you find the source, she called, remember that every crossing was built to contain it. Then the bronze doors shut, and the archive disappeared. #### the tunnel of names. Route Zero descended deeper than any crossing line. Amber lanterns hung at irregular intervals, illuminating carvings etched into the stone walls. At first Eleanor thought they were symbols. Then she realized they were names. Thousands of them. Some belonged to towns she recognized from the map of lost stations. Others were unfamiliar. A few had dates beside them. 1878. 1879. 1880. 1881. And farther down. 1812. 1813. 1814. Gideon ran his fingers across one of the carvings. These are older than the railroads. Elias nodded from the cab doorway. The crossings borrowed the tracks. The source was here first. Then what traveled through it before trains? Eleanor asked. Elias looked at the endless names on the walls. People. Hashtag the river of tracks. Hours later, the tunnel opened onto a cavern so vast that the lantern light could not reach its ceiling. A river flowed through the darkness below them. Except it was not water. It was made of tracks. Thousands of rails twisted together in a slow metallic current, crossing and uncrossing as they moved through the cavern. Some rose briefly into the air before sinking back into the flow. The locomotive crossed a narrow bridge suspended above the river. Samuel stared downward in awe. I thought the silver plane was impossible. The plane is only the surface, Elias said. As they reached the center of the bridge, a distant bell rang. The river of tracks responded. Rails shifted beneath them with a sound like a giant breathing. The bridge trembled. Keep moving. Gideon shouted. Elias opened the throttle, and the locomotive surged forward just as the track behind them folded into the metallic current. Hashtag the forgotten station. Beyond the river lay a station unlike any they had seen. It was built from black stone, and no lanterns burned on its platforms. The sign above the depot had long since weathered away. The locomotive stopped. Why are we here? The conductor asked. Elias pointed toward the platform. A man stood there in a faded engineer's coat. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert. You found the gate, he said. Elias climbed down from the engine. I found the road. The engineer's gaze moved to the others. More passengers. The source hasn't had visitors in a very long time. Who are you? Eleanor asked. The man touched the brim of his cap. Nathan Crow. First expedition engineer. The conductor stared at him. You disappeared in 1878. Nathan gave a weary smile. So I've been told. You're alive? Samuel asked. That depends on how you define the journey. Nathan led them into the dark station office. Dust covered the counters, but a telegraph key sat in the center of the room. It clicked once as they entered. Welcome back. No one touched it. Hashtag the truth of the crossings. Nathan lit a single lamp. The archivists told you the crossings were built to contain the source, he said. That's only half true. What's the other half? Eleanor asked. They were built to keep people from hearing the bell clearly. Margaret tightened her grip on the clapper. Why? Nathan looked toward the darkness beyond the station. Because the first bell doesn't summon towns. It summons memories. Gideon frowned. That makes no sense. Think about every crossing you've seen, Nathan said. Vanished stations. Returning passengers. Towns that refuse to die. The source preserves what people are unwilling to lose. Eleanor felt a sudden chill. Black Hollow. Black Hollow vanished because its people answered the bell together, Nathan said. The crossing caught them before the source could. Elias lowered his head. I thought I had doomed the town. You delayed its arrival, Nathan replied. Another bell rang in the distance. This time it sounded closer. The station walls vibrated. The source knows the fragment is near, Nathan said. If you intend to return it, there isn't much time. #### the chamber of the first bell. They left the forgotten station and followed a narrow track through a canyon of black stone. The golden light ahead grew brighter with every step. At last the canyon opened into a circular chamber. In the center hung the first bell. It was enormous, suspended from chains that disappeared into darkness above. Its surface was covered with faintly glowing lines that resembled railroad maps spreading across an entire continent. And beneath it stood an empty cradle of bronze shaped exactly like the clapper in Margaret's hands. The bell rang once. The sound passed through Eleanor like a memory she could not quite recall. She saw flashes of black hollow before it vanished. Children skating on the frozen pond. Lanterns on Main Street. The church bell ringing at dusk. Margaret gasped softly. I can hear them, she whispered. Elias stepped forward. The town remembers itself. Nathan looked at the cradle. Place the fragment there. Margaret hesitated. What happens then? Nathan's expression was impossible to read. Either the crossings are renewed, he said, or every lost road opens at once. The first bell rang again, louder than before. The chains holding it trembled. Far away, somewhere beyond the chamber, hundreds of whistles answered from unseen tracks. Margaret looked at Eleanor. If this is the bell that called Black Hollow, she said, then perhaps it deserves to be whole. Slowly, she stepped toward the cradle. The golden light flared around her. And for the first time since the Colorado Valley disappeared, the missing piece of the first bell was about to return to the place where every crossing began. Continuation, when the bell became whole. Margaret Hale lifted the bronze clapper with both hands. The first bell glowed brighter, its engraved lines spreading across the surface like rivers of light. The chamber filled with a deep humming that Eleanor felt in her bones more than in her ears. Behind them, the track they had followed began ringing softly, rail against rail, as if distant trains were answering a signal. Margaret, the conductor said quietly, if you're uncertain, now is the time to stop. Margaret looked up at the bell. I taught children to finish what they started, she said. I should probably follow my own lessons. She placed the clapper into the empty cradle. #### the whole bell. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the clapper locked into place with a sound like a signal switch thrown across an entire continent. The first bell rang. The chamber exploded with golden light. Eleanor staggered backward as memories poured through her mind that were not her own. She saw Black Hollow being built. Elias Mercer driving the first survey stake into the valley soil. Children carrying books into Margaret's schoolhouse. The winter blizzard of 1883. The night the town vanished. But the visions did not stop there. She saw other towns. A mining settlement disappearing into fog. A coastal station swallowed by a storm and reappearing on silver tracks. A village from centuries before the railroad era following a bell through a mountain pass. The first bell rang again. Across the chamber walls, glowing lines spread outward like branching railways. The air filled with overlapping sounds, whistles, footsteps, church bells, telegraph clicks, and voices speaking names long forgotten. Nathan Crow dropped to one knee. It's waking too quickly, he said. Mara Voss had warned them that the crossings were built to contain the source. Now Eleanor understood why. #### the open roads. Deep within the darkness beyond the chamber, something shifted. Then came the whistles. Not one. Hundreds. Tracks began appearing across the floor of the chamber, branching in every direction. Some led into darkness. Others rose into the air before vanishing. Lanterns flared to life along routes that had been dead for generations. Samuel Reed stared in horror. Every lost road is opening. The first bell rang a third time. In the distance, a blue whistle answered. Then another. Collector trains. Elias gripped the railing around the bell platform. The collectors are coming to shut it down. Can they? Gideon asked. Nathan shook his head. Not while the bell is whole. Golden light surged through the chamber. For an instant, Eleanor could see beyond the stone walls into the vast network of crossings. Trains were moving everywhere. Towns drifted across silver plains. Signal towers lit up one after another. And among them, she saw a black hollow. The town was no longer wandering blindly. Its tracks now connected directly to the source. Hashtag the voice of the bell. As the light intensified, a new sound emerged from the ringing. A voice. Not spoken aloud, but heard inside every mind in the chamber. Who remembers? Margaret gasped. Did you hear that? Everyone nodded. The voice came again. Who remembers the roads? Elias looked up at the bell with awe and fear. It's asking for witnesses. The conductor whispered, a bell can't speak. Nathan's eyes remained fixed on the glowing metal. Perhaps we've been wrong about what a bell is. The voice echoed through the chamber once more. Who will keep the crossings? The golden lines across the bell began rearranging themselves, forming a map unlike any Eleanor had seen. Routes connected, separated, and reformed. Some faded. Others brightened. Mara Vasa's warning returned to her, if the fragment returns to the source, the crossings may never be the same. Hashtag the collectors arrive. Blue lantern light flooded the entrance canyon. The collectors had reached the source. Shadow figures stepped onto the tracks, their black ledgers glowing with cold light. Behind them loomed the massive Blue Lantern locomotive. The lead collector raised a hand. By order of the crossing, the first bell must be silenced. The bell answered with a deafening tone. Blue lanterns flickered. The collectors paused. For the first time, Eleanor saw uncertainty in their movements. Elias stepped forward. The bell is whole again, he said. The old orders no longer apply. The lead collector opened its ledger. Pages turned violently in the wind of the ringing chamber. Then the writing began to disappear. Line after line faded from the pages. The collector looked down at the emptying ledger. Records are being rewritten, it said. The first bell rang again. Across the chamber, dead tracks burst into golden light. One of the collector's shadow attendants dissolved into drifting mist. Another dropped its ledger as the pages turned blank. Samuel stared in disbelief. The bell is erasing their authority. Hashtag the new keeper. The voice of the bell returned, stronger than before. The roads are open. A keeper is required. The golden map on the bell shifted again. One route blazed brighter than all the others. Black Hollow. The voice continued. The town that moved. The bell that returned. The witness who came back. Eleanor felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her. No, she said immediately. I'm not a keeper. But the ticket in her pocket began burning with heat. She pulled it out. The words on its surface had changed. Eastern Crossing. Passage complete. Keeper assigned. The conductor stepped back slowly. The crossing chose you. I never agreed to this. Nathan gave a sad smile. Neither did the first keepers. The bell's voice filled the chamber. Will you remember the roads? Eleanor looked around. At Margaret, who had carried the fragment for a century. At Elias, who had sacrificed himself for the town. At the conductor who had spent decades guiding lost passengers. At Black Hollow glowing on the map of the bell. If she refused, the crossings might remain open without anyone to guide them. If she accepted, she would become part of the very mystery she had come to investigate. The collectors waited in silence. The first bell rang once more. Eleanor closed her fingers around the burning ticket. Yes, she said. #### the ringing world. The chamber erupted with light. Golden lines spread from the first bell across every track, every crossing, every hidden station. The blue lanterns of the collectors dimmed. Their ledgers closed by themselves. Outside the source, whistles answered across the endless network of roads. Black Hollow's bell rang in harmony with the first bell. And somewhere far above, beyond the silver plains and the hidden crossings, the empty Colorado Valley where the town had vanished more than a century earlier echoed with a bell tone that had not been heard there since 1891. The roads were open. The bell was whole. And Eleanor Bellamy, archivist from Denver, had become the first keeper of the crossings in generations. Continuation, the first morning of the keeper. When the light faded, the chamber was no longer trembling. The first bell hung silently above them, whole and complete. Its golden lines had settled into a steady glow that resembled a living map. Tracks no longer burst from the floor in wild directions. Instead, they formed an ordered network radiating outward from the source. Eleanor realized she could feel every route. Not physically, but somewhere behind her thoughts. A freight line crossing the Nevada desert. A forgotten station beneath the Appalachian Mountains. A drifting town moving through silver fog. Black Hollow traveling slowly along its newly formed route. She knew where each one was. The knowledge nearly drove her to her knees. Margaret caught her arm. Easy. I can hear them, Eleanor whispered. The bells. The crossings. Thousands of faint signals pulsed through her mind like distant telegraph clicks. #### the silent collectors. At the entrance to the chamber, the collectors remained motionless. Their blue lanterns had faded to a pale white. The lead collector looked down at its blank ledger, then slowly closed it. The records have changed, it said. Mara Voss stepped beside Eleanor. What becomes of them now? The collector raised its head. The old counts are ended. One by one, the shadow figures behind it dissolved into drifting mist. Their lanterns fell silently onto the tracks and went dark. Only the lead collector remained. Will you oppose the new keeper? The conductor asked. The figure looked at Eleanor for a long moment. The crossings require balance, it said. If she maintains it, no opposition is necessary. Then it turned and walked back into the canyon, carrying the empty ledger beneath a lantern that no longer burned blue. #### the price of keeping. Mara Voss faced Eleanor. You should know what the bell has given you. I can feel the routes, Eleanor said. That is only the beginning. Mara pointed toward the first bell. The keepers do not merely guide the crossings. They remember them. As she spoke, new memories flooded Eleanor's mind. A stationmaster in 1812 ringing a warning bell during a snowstorm. A woman in 1769 leading villagers through a mountain pass lit by lanterns. A child in 1683 hearing a bell beneath the earth and following it into the fog. Eleanor gasped. Those aren't my memories. They belong to the crossings, Mara said. And now they belong to you. How many are there? Mara's expression softened. Enough to fill a lifetime. More than one lifetime, perhaps. #### Black Hollow's new route. Outside the chamber, a whistle sounded. Black Hollow had reached the source platform. The town rolled into view beneath the golden light, its lanterns glowing warmly. Residents crowded the station platform, staring at the open 10th gate and the chamber beyond. Jonah Whitfield stepped down first. "We felt the bell ring," he said. The whole town changed direction by itself. Clara followed him, her eyes wide. The tracks outside are different. They lead everywhere. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and saw the new network spreading across the crossings. Black Hollow was no longer trapped on a single route. It had become a junction. ###The return of Elias Mercer. Elias stood quietly beside Engine Zero, watching the townspeople reunite. Margaret approached him. "You came back," she said. So did Black Hollow. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two people separated by more than a century of impossible roads. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. Elias glanced toward Eleanor. "That depends on what the keeper needs." Eleanor opened her eyes. For the first time, she noticed something she had missed before. The golden lines on the first bell included a route that ended abruptly. Route 0. "Elias," she said slowly, "your route isn't complete." He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The bell still has an unfinished line." As if in answer, the first bell rang once. A new track began forming at the edge of the chamber. #### The missing station. The track extended into darkness beyond the source, heading somewhere none of them had seen before. Golden sparks danced along the rails as they appeared. Mara Voss frowned. That route wasn't there before. Eleanor could feel the bell's attention fixed upon it. Then a name appeared in glowing letters above the new line. #### Last station. Samuel took an involuntary step backward. "I've heard that name." "From where?" Gideon asked. "Collector stories. A place where unfinished journeys end." Elias stared at the track. "I never reached it." "No one has," Mara said. The first bell rang again. This time Eleanor understood the meaning without words. The route belonged to Elias Mercer. His journey through Route 0 had been interrupted when he returned to warn Black Hollow. The crossings had remained unresolved until the bell became whole. Now the road was waiting for him. #### The keeper's first choice. Elias looked at Eleanor. "Can I refuse?" Eleanor reached toward the bell's glowing map. The answer came to her instantly. "Yes," she said. "The crossings no longer force anyone to travel." "Then why does the road exist?" "Because unfinished journeys still ask to be finished." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to go." Elias was silent for a long time. At last he smiled, the weary smile of a man who had spent decades chasing the end of a line. "I think," he said gently, "I've been heading there since the day I named a valley Black Hollow." He climbed into the cab of Engine Zero. The locomotive's amber lantern brightened. "Will you come back?" Eleanor asked. Elias looked toward the newly formed track. "If the last station is truly the end of the journey," he said, "then there may be nowhere left to return from." Margaret stepped forward and placed a hand against the side of the engine. "Then let it be a good ending," she whispered. #### The departure. Engine Zero rolled onto the new track. The last station line glowed beneath its wheels. As the locomotive moved away, the first bell rang softly, not as a warning or a summons, but as a farewell. Elias lifted a hand from the cab window. Margaret answered with a trembling wave. The engine entered the darkness beyond the source. For a few moments its amber lantern remained visible. Then it vanished. Hashtag the new keeper. Silence settled over the chamber. Black Hollow waited on its tracks. The townspeople stood together beneath the golden light. Mara Voss closed the great ledger and placed it before Eleanor. "The crossings are yours now," she said. Eleanor looked at the endless network glowing across the first bell. Some routes were busy. Some were fading. Some had not yet been discovered. And somewhere beyond every mapped road, Engine 0 was traveling toward the last station. The bell rang once more. Not for departure. For beginning. And as Black Hollow's lanterns flickered in the vast chamber of the source, Eleanor Bellamy understood that the mystery of the vanished town had never really been about where it went. It had been about who would remember the roads after it moved. Continuation, the first winter of the Keeper. The day after Engine 0 vanished into the darkness of the last station line, snow began falling inside the source. Not from a sky, because the cavern had no visible sky, but from the golden haze above the tracks. The flakes drifted slowly through the chamber and melted before touching the rails. Mara Voss watched them with concern. "That shouldn't happen," she said. Eleanor looked up from the great ledger. "What does it mean?" "The crossings are bleeding seasons into one another." The word sent a ripple of unease through the townspeople gathered around the platform. Black Hollow had survived disappearance, exile, collectors, and transformation, but this was different. The source itself was changing. Eleanor placed a hand on the ledger. The moment her fingers touched the worn leather cover, the network of routes bloomed across her mind. She felt summer heat on a desert line in Arizona, spring rain falling on a hidden station in Kentucky, and a bitter winter storm gathering somewhere far to the north. Then she felt something else. A route trembling. "There's a problem," she said. Mara's eyes narrowed. "Where?" "Northwestern line. A station called Greywater." Samuel Reed swore softly. Greywater was marked unstable on the old maps. "What happens if it fails?" Jonah asked. "A crossing collapses," Mara answered. "And anything traveling through it can be lost between routes." Hashtag the Keeper's train. By afternoon, preparations were underway. Black Hollow could not simply abandon the source, but neither could Eleanor ignore a failing crossing. The first bell had made her keeper, and she could feel Greywater weakening with every passing minute. "You'll need a train," the conductor said. "Can't I just open a route?" Eleanor asked. Mara shook her head. "A keeper can guide crossings, but the roads still require travelers." Samuel led them to a smaller engine resting on a side track. Unlike Engine 0, this locomotive was built of polished brass and dark wood. A single white lantern hung above its smokebox. "This belonged to the archive," Samuel said. "It hasn't run in decades." The conductor climbed into the cab and examined the controls. "She'll run," he said. "Might complain about it, but she'll run." Eleanor noticed a nameplate beneath the lantern. Hashtag memory. Margaret Hale smiled faintly. "Appropriate." "Who's coming?" Eleanor asked. Mara stepped forward first. "The archive needs eyes on Greywater." Samuel nodded. "I know unstable crossings." Gideon adjusted his spectacles. "And I know signal towers." The conductor snorted. "Someone has to keep this old engine on the rails." Margaret looked toward Black Hollow, where lanterns were beginning to glow for evening. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "The town has a bell again. Someone should be here when it rings." Eleanor hugged her briefly before boarding memory. ### Greywater. The route to Greywater crossed territory Eleanor had never sensed before. Tracks wound through forests of black pine where lanterns hung from branches like fruit. They crossed bridges suspended over silver mist and past signal towers that flashed white, then dark, then white again. As they traveled, the tremor in the crossing grew stronger. "We're close," Eleanor said. Then the fog ahead parted. Greywater Station appeared beside a frozen lake. At first glance it looked ordinary, a depot, a water tower, a row of cottages. But the tracks leading into the station were fractured. Sections of rail faded in and out of existence. Snow blew sideways despite the still air. Most unsettling of all, the station clock spun backward. "Crossing instability," Samuel said grimly. As memory rolled onto the platform, the depot doors burst open. A woman in a heavy coat ran toward them. "Thank God," she gasped. "We thought no one could hear the signal." "I'm Eleanor Bellamy," Eleanor said. "Keeper of the crossings." The woman stared. Then the stories were true. "What happened here?" Mara asked. "The lake started freezing in July," the woman said. "Then trains began arriving from the wrong years." Gideon looked sharply at the backward spinning clock. "How many?" "3 this week." As if summoned by her words, a whistle echoed across the frozen lake. A train emerged from the fog. Its engine was ancient, wood-burning, decades older than any locomotive that should still exist. And it was heading straight toward the broken crossing. ### the wrong year. The conductor grabbed the brake lever on memory. "That train won't see the fracture." Eleanor closed her eyes and reached for the crossing. For the first time, she felt the rails as if they were nerves beneath the earth. The fractured section flickered in her mind, unstable and cold. The ancient train thundered closer. "Can you stop it?" Samuel shouted. "I can try." Eleanor focused on the broken rails. The first bell's resonance answered somewhere deep within her. The fractured track solidified. 4-3 heartbeats. The old locomotive crossed the gap and screamed past the station, vanishing into fog on the far side. The rails immediately shattered again. Eleanor staggered. Mara caught her arm. "You held the crossing physically. Keepers aren't meant to do that for long." "Then how do we fix it?" Eleanor asked. Gideon pointed toward the frozen lake. In the center of the ice stood a signal tower half submerged in frost. Its lantern burned blue. ### the blue lantern. Samuel cursed under his breath. A collector signal. "I thought the collectors were finished," Jonah had said back at the source. Now Samuel shook his head. "The old collectors are gone. But their signals remain." The woman from Greywater looked bewildered. "That lantern appeared the same day the clock started running backward." Eleanor felt the crossing tugging toward the tower. "It's pulling routes out of sequence," she said. "That's why trains are arriving from the wrong years." "Can we shut it down?" the conductor asked. Samuel looked across the ice. "If we can reach it." ### the frozen lake. The ice groaned beneath their boots as they crossed toward the tower. With every step, Eleanor heard overlapping sounds, whistles from different decades, telegraph clicks, voices speaking dates instead of names. Near the center of the lake, the ice became transparent. Beneath it ran tracks. Dozens of them, moving slowly through dark water. Gideon stopped abruptly. "The crossing is under the lake." The blue lantern brightened. Suddenly the air around them changed. Snow vanished. For an instant they stood in summer sunlight. Then autumn leaves blew across the ice. Then spring rain. Then winter again. It's cycling years, Mara said through clenched teeth. The tower shuddered. A whistle sounded behind them. Eleanor turned. Another train was approaching the station. This one bore a date she recognized from the archive. 1891. Black Hollow's year. #### the train from Black Hollow. The locomotive rolled through the fog exactly as it must have on the night the town vanished. Lanterns glowed amber. Smoke curled from the stack. Passengers crowded the windows. And on the platform of the last car stood a younger Elias Mercer. No, Eleanor whispered. The crossing had pulled a train out of Black Hollow's past. It was heading straight toward the fractured rails. If it reached the break, the entire crossing could collapse. Samuel grabbed the Blue Lantern's control lever. I can shut it down, but once I pull this, every unstable route connected to Greywater will snap back into alignment. Including that train? Gideon asked. Samuel nodded grimly. Eleanor looked from the approaching train to the glowing lantern. Through the windows she could see townspeople laughing, talking, living the final hours before Black Hollow disappeared. Ghosts of a moment that had already happened. The younger Elias raised a hand, unaware of the future waiting for him. The train drew closer. The fractured rails flickered. Eleanor, Mara said urgently, decide. The keeper of the crossing stood on the frozen lake, one hand on the Blue Lantern, while a train from 1891 thundered toward a broken route that should never have existed again. And for the first time since accepting the first bell, Eleanor Bellamy faced a choice the crossings could not make for her. Continuation, the choice on the frozen lake. The train from 1891 screamed across the ice-laced valley, its amber lanterns reflecting in the dark water beneath the transparent lake. Eleanor could see faces in the windows now. Children carrying schoolbooks. A baker wiping flour from his hands. A young woman laughing at something a passenger beside her had said. And on the rear platform, a younger Elias Mercer stood with one hand resting on the railing, unaware that his town had already become legend. Pull the lever, Mara urged. If the crossing collapses, we could lose every connected route. Samuel's hand hovered over the Blue Lantern mechanism. Once I shut it down, he said, that train will snap back to its proper year. Or vanish, Gideon added quietly. The fractured rails ahead of the train flickered in and out of existence. Eleanor felt the crossing trembling beneath her feet. The first bell's resonance pulsed through her mind, offering no command, only awareness. The decision was hers. She looked at the younger Elias. Then she looked at Samuel. Pull it. #### the snap of time. Samuel yanked the lever. The Blue Lantern shattered. A burst of cold light exploded across the lake. Every season vanished at once. Summer, autumn, spring, and winter collapsed into a single instant of blinding white. The train from 1891 reached the fractured rails. And disappeared. Not in a crash. Not in an explosion. One moment it was there, steam billowing into the air. The next, the track ahead was empty. The station clock stopped spinning backward. Then slowly began moving forward. Greywater fell silent. Eleanor's knees gave way. Mara caught her before she hit the ice. You did the right thing, Mara said. Eleanor stared at the empty track. I erased a moment from existence. No, Mara replied gently. You returned it to where it belonged. #### the echo. As they walked back toward the station, a soft bell rang behind them. Eleanor turned. On the far side of the lake, just for an instant, she saw the 1891 train again. It was distant now, moving through golden fog on a restored route. The younger Elias looked in her direction. Then the train rounded a curve and vanished. Samuel exhaled slowly. The route corrected itself. Gideon looked relieved for the first time all night. Gray water is stabilizing. But Eleanor could still feel something unresolved. Not in gray water. In herself. #### the passenger without a ticket. Back at the station, the woman in the heavy coat was waiting with hot coffee and a stack of weathered papers. These started appearing when the clock went wrong, she said. Eleanor took the top page. It was a passenger manifest. Black Hollow, October 6, 1891. She frowned. This shouldn't be here. Then she noticed the final entry. Passenger destination. Eleanor Bellamy, Black Hollow. Her blood ran cold. What is it? The conductor asked. She handed him the manifest. His eyes widened. That's impossible. I wasn't alive in 1891, Eleanor said. Mara took the paper and studied it carefully. The crossing is still adjusting, she murmured. Meaning? Mara looked at her. The routes now remember you. #### the return to the source. Gray water remained stable through the night. By dawn, the fractured rails had solidified, the blue signal was gone, and no more trains arrived from the wrong years. The crossing had healed. As memory prepared to depart, the station woman pressed the passenger manifest into Eleanor's hands. Whatever that means, she said, it belongs with you. The return journey felt different. Where the outward trip had been tense and uncertain, the route home moved smoothly through the network. Signal towers flashed white in greeting as they passed. The rails no longer trembled beneath the engine. When the golden glow of the source appeared ahead, Eleanor felt the first bell answer inside her chest. Black Hollow was waiting on the platform. Margaret hurried forward as soon as the train stopped. You're back. Greywater's stable, Eleanor said. Then she handed Margaret the manifest. Margaret read the final line and looked up sharply. Eleanor. I know. The crossings are writing you into their history, Mara said from behind them. #### the empty route. That evening, Eleanor stood alone in the Hall of Bells. The first bell glowed softly overhead. Its map had changed again. Most routes burned with steady golden light. One line remained dark. Last station. Elias Mercer's route had not returned. Eleanor touched the map. Instead of the silence she expected, she felt a faint pulse. Not from the last station. From somewhere beyond it. The great ledger on the table opened by itself. New writing appeared across the page. Route 0, active. Last station, past. Final destination, unknown. Then another line formed beneath it. One passenger continues east. Eleanor stared at the words. Elias had not reached the end. He had gone beyond it. #### the keeper's burden. Late that night, the first bell rang softly. Eleanor felt new routes stirring at the edges of the network. Gray water had been only the first unstable crossing. Others would follow. Some would need repair. Some would need closing. And some might open roads that had been hidden for centuries. She unfolded the passenger manifest one more time. Her own name stared back at her from the page dated 1891. For the first time, she understood what Mara had meant. Keepers did not merely remember the crossings. Eventually, the crossings remembered them. Outside, Black Hollow's lanterns glowed warmly against the vast darkness of the source. Somewhere far beyond the mapped routes, Engine 0 was still traveling eastward. And beneath the steady ringing of the first bell, Eleanor Bellamy realized that the mystery of Black Hollow was no longer a story she had uncovered. It was a story she had entered. And the roads were still writing it. Continuation, the year the crossings remembered. Winter settled over the source in a way that no season ever had before. Snow drifted through the golden haze above the tracks, but now it reached the ground. The flakes rested on the rails of Black Hollow, on the roof of the station, and on the steps of the schoolhouse before slowly dissolving into light. Margaret Hale rang the town bell each evening at 9. The sound no longer warned people indoors. It reminded them that the town still existed. Eleanor spent most of her days in the Hall of Bells, learning the language of the crossings. The first bell's map shifted constantly. New routes appeared for hours and vanished again. Old routes brightened when travelers entered them. Some lines pulsed weakly, like fading heartbeats. Mara Voss taught her how to read the changes. A crossing is a conversation, Mara said one afternoon. When a route weakens, something on one side has stopped listening. Eleanor looked up from the ledger. And when a route grows stronger? Mara's gaze drifted toward Black Hollow. Then someone has remembered it. Hashtag the 13th bell. On the first day of January, the impossible happened. The first bell rang 13 times. Not 9. Not once. 13. Every lantern in the source flared white. The map on the bell rearranged itself in a violent cascade of light. Routes twisted, crossed, and reformed. Eleanor felt a surge of memories that were not hers. A station buried beneath a desert. A lighthouse that rang like a bell. A train traveling under a sea of stars with no earth beneath its tracks. Then one memory remained after the others faded. A door. Black iron. Marked with the number 13. Eleanor gasped and grabbed the edge of the table. What did you see? Mara asked. Another gate. Mara went completely still. Describe it. When Eleanor finished, Mara closed the ledger with trembling hands. There were rumors, she whispered. Before the archive sealed the 10th gate. You knew about this? Only stories. A hidden route beyond Route 0. The archivists called it the 13th crossing. Outside, Black Hollow's bell answered with a single tone. Hashtag the passenger in the snow. That night, a stranger arrived in Black Hollow. The townspeople found him standing beside the water tower with snow on his coat and no footprints behind him. He carried a leather satchel and wore a conductor's uniform unlike any Eleanor had seen. When brought to the station, he removed his cap. His hair was silver, and his eyes reflected the golden light of the source. I'm looking for the keeper, he said. Who are you? Eleanor asked. The man studied her for a long moment. My name is Adrian Holt. I came from the 13th crossing. The room fell silent. Margaret tightened her grip on the bell rope. There is no 13th crossing. Adrian gave a weary smile. That depends on which year you ask. Hashtag the lost ledger. Adrian opened his satchel and removed a small black ledger. Mara Voss's face went pale. Where did you get that? From the archive, Adrian said. Or rather, from the part of the archive that was removed from history. He placed the ledger on the table. The cover bore a single symbol, 13. The 13th crossing was built after the first expedition, Adrian explained. The archivists feared the source would eventually awaken, so they created a hidden route to carry away anything too dangerous for the network. And then? Samuel asked. Then the crossing was erased. By whom? Adrian looked toward the first bell. By the keepers. Eleanor frowned. Why would they erase it? Adrian opened the ledger. Inside were names. Not towns. People. Hundreds of them. Some entries were crossed out in red ink. Others had dates beside them. The final page was blank except for a single line. When the first bell becomes whole, the 13th crossing returns. Hashtag the warning. Adrian leaned forward. The collectors weren't the only thing the archive feared. The 13th crossing leads somewhere even the source cannot fully map. Where? Jonah asked. Adrian shook his head. We called it the unwritten line. That's not a place, Gideon said. Exactly. Eleanor felt the first bell stir in response to the words. Why come here now? She asked. Adrian's expression darkened. Because something has started using the 13th crossing. A cold silence filled the station. What? Samuel whispered. Adrian looked directly at Eleanor. A train with no destination. Hashtag the empty train. Before anyone could question him further, the bell in the schoolhouse tower rang by itself. Once. Twice. 13 times. Eleanor felt every route in the network tremble. Then she saw it. Not with her eyes. Through the crossings. A train moving along a line that did not exist on the first bell's map. Its lanterns were dark. Its windows were empty. And yet it was traveling faster than any route in the network. Wherever it passed, crossings faded. Signal towers went dark. Routes vanished from the map. It's heading here, she whispered. Mara gripped the edge of the table. How long? Eleanor followed the pulse through the network. 3 nights. Adrian closed the black ledger. Then you understand why I came. What is that train? Margaret asked. Adrian looked toward the snow falling beyond the station windows. The last thing the 13th crossing carried away. And what was that? Jonah asked. Adrian's answer came almost as a whisper. A keeper who refused to let the roads be remembered. Hashtag the name on the last page. The black ledger suddenly opened by itself. Ink spread across the blank final page. Everyone watched in silence as letters formed one by one. Approaching route. 13th crossing. Current operator. Keeper Henry Vale. Gideon stared at the name. The color drained from his face. Vale, he whispered. You know him? Eleanor asked. Gideon sank into a chair. Henry Vale was my grandfather. The first bell rang once more. Far away, beyond every mapped route, a whistle answered from the darkness of the unwritten line. And for the first time since Black Hollow vanished, the keepers of the crossings realized that the greatest danger to the network might not come from the source, the collectors, or the eastern line. It might come from another keeper who had decided that some road should never be remembered again. Continuation, the night the forgotten keeper returned. For the next 3 days, no one in Black Hollow slept well. The first bell rang at irregular hours. Sometimes once at dawn. Sometimes twice at midnight. Each time, Eleanor felt the network of crossings tighten around a single moving point far beyond the mapped routes. The empty train was coming. Its approach left scars across the crossings. Signal towers that had burned white for decades suddenly went dark. Minor routes faded from the bell's map. Once, while Eleanor was studying the ledger, an entire branch line in New Mexico vanished from the network for several minutes before returning. It's erasing paths as it travels, Mara Voss said grimly. Not erasing, Adrian Holt corrected. Forgetting. That word unsettled Eleanor more than any other. She had become keeper because the crossings needed someone to remember the roads. If another keeper was moving through the network causing routes to be forgotten, then the struggle was not merely about trains or gates. It was about memory itself. #### Gideon's story. On the evening of the second day, Gideon Vale asked Eleanor to walk with him to the edge of Black Hollow. They stood near the old water tower while snow drifted through the golden haze of the source. "I was 7 when my grandfather disappeared," Gideon said. "You never told me that." He gave a bitter smile. "There was never a reason. Henry Vale was a signal keeper on a remote crossing line. One winter he locked himself in his tower and refused to answer any telegraph messages. What happened? When they finally forced the door open, the tower was empty. The lantern was still burning. The telegraph key was still clicking. Gideon looked toward the dark horizon beyond the source. My family was told he'd gone mad from isolation. But my grandmother swore she heard a train whistle that night, even though no tracks ran near the tower. Eleanor thought of the black ledger and the name that had appeared on its final page. Do you think he became a keeper? Gideon was silent for a long time. I think he heard something the rest of us couldn't, he said at last. #### The White Lantern. On the third night, the warning came. A signal tower appeared outside Black Hollow that had not existed before. Its lantern burned white. Then black. Then white again. Adrian Holt saw it first and ran to the station. He's close, he said. The townspeople gathered on Main Street. In the distance, beyond the tower, a line of darkness moved through the fog. No lanterns. No smoke. No whistle. Only the shape of a train. The first bell began ringing. Not an alarm. In recognition. #### The empty train arrives. The train rolled into Black Hollow without a sound. Its engine was matte black, absorbing the lantern light around it. Frost covered the metal despite the warmth of the source. Every passenger window reflected the town, but no faces looked back. On the front of the locomotive was a single brass number. ###13. The train stopped beside the station. A door opened. An old man stepped onto the platform. He wore a conductor's coat faded almost white with age. Snow rested on his shoulders though none was falling. His eyes were pale gray, and when he looked at Black Hollow, the town's lanterns dimmed slightly. Henry Vale, Gideon whispered. The old man turned toward him. For a moment, something like surprise crossed his face. Gideon, he said softly. You grew old. And you didn't, Gideon replied. Henry's gaze shifted to Eleanor. So the bell chose another keeper. Eleanor stepped forward. Why are you here? Henry looked around at the glowing windows of Black Hollow. To finish what should have been finished before this town was ever built. #### The first keeper's warning. They gathered inside the station while the black train waited silently outside. Henry Vale removed his gloves and placed them on the table beside the black ledger. You've awakened the source, he said. The crossings are opening again. That's why they exist, Eleanor replied. Henry shook his head. No. The crossings exist to limit what the source can remember. Mara Voss frowned. That's not what the archive teaches. Henry gave her a tired look. Because the archive forgot. Silence filled the room. Henry continued. When the first keepers discovered the source, they realized it could preserve anything. A town. A train. A person. But preservation has a cost. The more the source remembers, the less the ordinary world can hold. What does that mean? Jonah asked. ### Henry pointed toward Black Hollow. Look at your town. It vanished from Colorado because the source remembered it too strongly. Eleanor felt a chill. And now? Henry's pale eyes settled on the first bell glowing through the station window. Now the source is remembering everything again. Hashtag the forgotten towns. Henry opened the black ledger. Instead of names, the pages now showed maps. One by one, towns appeared and faded. Ashmere, he said. Gone. The map vanished. Hollow Creek. Gone. St. Elmo Junction. Gone. Each town disappeared from the page as he spoke. Those crossings collapsed decades ago, Mara said. No, Henry replied. They were released. He looked at Eleanor. I became keeper when I realized what was happening. Every time the source fully remembered a place, that place faded from the world beyond the crossings. So I began closing routes. Adrian's expression hardened. By sending them into the 13th crossing. Henry nodded. A place where memory cannot anchor. You erased towns, Samuel said. I let them rest, Henry answered quietly. Hashtag the proof. Henry reached into his coat and removed a photograph. He handed it to Eleanor. It showed a bustling town square filled with people and electric streetlights. On the back was written. Ashmere, Kansas, 1924. That town doesn't exist, Eleanor said. Exactly, Henry replied. He produced another photograph. A harbor crowded with fishing boats. Greywater Bay, 1911. Gideon frowned. Greywater is a frozen crossing station. It was once a coastal town, Henry said. The source remembered it after a storm. The world forgot it. Eleanor stared at the photographs. You're saying every lost crossing was once a real place? Henry nodded. And if the source continues awakening, more places will follow. Hashtag the bell and the world. Outside, the first bell rang once. Black Hollow's lanterns brightened. Far beyond the town, the golden haze of the source spread a little farther into the darkness. Henry stood. You think you're preserving the roads, he said to Eleanor. But you're feeding the bell. Then what do you want me to do? Close the source. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Mara stepped forward. That would sever the crossings. Yes. Black Hollow would disappear. Henry looked out the window at the town. Black Hollow disappeared in 1891. What remains is a memory traveling on rails. Margaret Hale entered the station at that moment, carrying the school bell's rope in one hand. Then it's a memory worth keeping, she said. Hashtag the keeper against the keeper. Henry and Margaret faced each other across the station. How many people have lived in this town since it vanished? Margaret asked. The same people, Henry replied. No, she said. People changed. Children grew up. Marriages happened. Friends were buried. We weren't frozen. Henry's expression faltered. The source preserves, he insisted. It preserves enough for us to continue, Margaret said. That isn't the same thing as stopping. Eleanor felt the first bell answering Margaret's words. The golden map shifted slightly. Henry saw it too. For the first time, uncertainty entered his pale eyes. You've changed the source, he said softly. No, Eleanor replied. Black Hollow did. Hashtag the last argument. Henry stepped toward the door. Outside, his black train waited beneath the ringing bell. If you keep the source open, he said without turning around, the day will come when the world beyond the crossings begins to forget entire cities. And if I close it? Eleanor asked. The road's end. Silence stretched between them. Then Henry looked back at her. I didn't come here to fight you, Eleanor Bellamy. I came because I hoped you would understand what I failed to stop. He placed the black ledger on the table. Read the final pages when you're ready. Then he boarded the empty train. The door closed. No whistle sounded. The black locomotive rolled away into the darkness beyond Black Hollow, and as it vanished, one route on the first bell's map faded to a thin gray line. The 13th crossing. ##### the final pages. Long after the train disappeared, Eleanor opened the black ledger. The last pages were filled with Henry Vale's handwriting. The first keeper believed memory should be preserved. The second believed memory should be limited. I have spent 40 years carrying what the source was forced to forget. If you choose to keep the bell awake, know that every road saved will ask something of the world that lost it. And one day, when the balance breaks, the crossings will ask for something too large to give back. At the bottom of the final page was a single sentence. When that day comes, follow engine 0 east. Eleanor closed the ledger. Outside, the first bell rang once. Far away, beyond every mapped route, a faint amber whistle answered from the darkness where Elias Mercer's train was still traveling. And in the silent space between those two sounds, Eleanor Bellamy realized that the greatest choice of the crossings had not yet been made. The last bell. The winter after Henry Vale's visit became known in Black Hollow as the quiet season. The first bell no longer rang at random hours. The snow drifting through the source grew thinner each day. And the black train of the 13th crossing did not return. Yet Eleanor Bellamy could feel it moving somewhere beyond the mapped routes, carrying a keeper who believed forgetting was mercy. She read Henry's black ledger every night. Some pages described vanished towns. Others recorded routes that no longer existed. But near the end she found a passage that changed everything. The source does not choose between memory and forgetting. It chooses balance. When too much is remembered, the world grows heavy with what will not leave. When too much is forgotten, the roads grow empty and the bell falls silent. A keeper must learn when to hold on and when to let go. Eleanor closed the ledger and looked toward the glowing map of the crossings. For the first time, she understood that Henry Vale had not been her enemy. He had simply chosen one side of the balance. ##### the fading route. 3 months later, the first bell rang once. A single route on the map dimmed almost to nothing. Ashmere. The town Henry had shown her in the photograph. Eleanor touched the fading line and felt its memory, a summer fair, children chasing paper lanterns, a brass band playing in the square. The route was not being attacked. It was simply ending. Mara Voss joined her in the Hall of Bells. What happens if I keep it open? Eleanor asked. Mara was silent for a long moment. The source will remember Ashmere forever, she said. But somewhere in the ordinary world, something else will be forgotten to make room. Eleanor looked at the dim line. Then she let her hand fall away. The route faded. The memory of the summer fair remained in her mind, but the crossing itself slipped gently out of the network. The first bell rang softly. Not in warning. In acceptance. ##### the letter from the east. A week later, a telegraph key in the station office began clicking. Margaret Hale copied the message by hand and brought it to Eleanor. From Route 0. To the Keeper. The last station was not the end. The road continues. Elias Mercer. Eleanor read the message twice. Then a second line appeared on the paper, written in a different hand. When the balance is found, ring the bell for those who chose to leave. The signal ended. No further message came. ##### The final gathering. That evening, the people of Black Hollow gathered outside the schoolhouse. Lanterns lined Main Street. Snow had stopped falling. The source glowed warmly around the town. Eleanor stood beside Margaret at the bell rope. "What are we celebrating?" Jonah asked. Eleanor looked at the faces around her. People who had vanished from Colorado more than a century ago. People who had become passengers, wanderers, and survivors. People who had chosen to remain a town even after the world lost its map. "We're not celebrating," she said. "We're remembering." Margaret handed her the rope. "Then ring it. ##### The last bell." Eleanor pulled the rope. The school bell rang. Its tone rose through Black Hollow, through the source, through every crossing still alive in the network. The first bell answered from the Hall of Bells with a deep golden note. For a moment, the entire web of routes became visible. She saw gray water shining beside its frozen lake. Signal towers glowing across hidden valleys. Trains moving through silver fog. And far to the east, beyond every mapped road, Engine 0 traveling beneath a sky filled with stars. Elias Mercer looked up from the cab. As if he had heard her. The bell rang a second time. Routes that had faded peacefully glimmered once in farewell. Ashmere. Hollow Creek. Greywater Bay. Not returning. Not erased. Simply released. The bell rang a third time. The network settled into balance. Some roads remained bright. Some dimmed. And the first bell finally grew still. ##### Epilogue. Years later, travelers crossing the Colorado Plains would sometimes report a strange sight near the old Black Hollow Valley. On certain winter nights, a line of lanterns could be seen moving slowly through the fog. A church bell would ring once, and the lights would disappear. Most people dismissed the stories. But railroad workers along abandoned lines occasionally found fresh telegraph messages waiting on silent keys. Route stable. Passengers accounted for. Balance maintained. No sender was ever identified. In Denver, an archivist named Eleanor Bellamy was said to keep an old brass ticket in her desk drawer. When asked why, she would only smile and say, "Some roads should be remembered." And somewhere beyond the eastern line, where no map could follow, Engine 0 continued its endless journey while the first bell watched over the crossings it had once nearly consumed. Black Hollow never returned to the Colorado Valley. Yet it was never truly lost again. For as long as one bell rang, one lantern burned, and one keeper remembered the roads, the town that vanished in 1891 would keep traveling through the hidden tracks of the world. And when the wind blew across the plains on quiet winter nights, those who listened carefully could still hear the faint echo of a bell, carrying the memory of Black Hollow into the dark.